Chapter 24 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 24 on some country snobs. Tired of the town, where the sight of the closed shutters of the nobility, my friends, makes my heart sick in my walks, afraid almost to sit in those vast Pall Mall solitudes, the clubs, and of annoying the club waiters, who might, I thought, be going to shoot in the country; but for me, I determined on a brief tour in the provinces, and paying some visits in the country, which were long due. My first visit was to my friend Major Ponto, H.P. of the Horse Marines, in Mangelwurzelshire. The Major, in his little phaeton, was in waiting to take me up at the station. The vehicle was not certainly splendid, but such a carriage as would accommodate a plain man, as Ponto said he was, and a numerous family. We drove by beautiful fresh fields and green hedges, through a cheerful English landscape. The high road, as smooth and trim as the way in a nobleman's park, was charmingly checkered with cool shade and golden sunshine. Rustics in snowy smock frocks jerked their hats off, smiling as we passed. Children with cheeks as red as the apples in the orchards bobbed curtsies to us at the cottage doors. Blue church spires rose here and there in the distance, and as the buxom gardener's wife opened the white gate at the Major's little ivy-covered lodge, and we drove through the neat plantations of firs and evergreens up to the house, my bosom felt a joy and elation which I thought it was impossible to experience in the smoky atmosphere of a town. "Here," I mentally exclaimed, "is all peace, plenty, and happiness. Here I shall be rid of snobs. There can be none in this charming Arcadian spot." Stripes, the Major's man, formerly a corporal in his gallant corps, received my portmanteau and an elegant little present, which I had brought from town as a peace offering to Mrs. Ponto, viz., a cod and oysters from Grove's, in a hamper about the size of a coffin. Ponto's house, the Evergreens Mrs. P. has christened it, is a perfect paradise of a place. It is all over creepers and bow windows and verandas. A wavy lawn tumbles up and down around it, with flower beds of wonderful shapes, and zigzag gravel walks, and beautiful but damp shrubberies of myrtles and glistening laurustines, which have procured it its change of name. It was called Little Bullock's Pound in old Dr. Ponto's time. I had a view of the pretty grounds and the stable, and the adjoining village and church, and a great park beyond, from the windows of the bedroom whither Ponto conducted me. It was the yellow bedroom, the freshest and pleasantest of bedchambers. The air was fragrant with a large bouquet that was placed on the writing table. The linen was fragrant with the lavender in which it had been laid. The chintz hangings of the bed and the big sofa were, if not fragrant with flowers, at least painted all over with them. The pen wiper on the table was the imitation of a double dahlia, and there was accommodation for my watch in a sunflower on the mantelpiece. A scarlet-leaved creeper came curling over the windows, through which the setting sun was pouring a flood of golden light. It was all flowers and freshness. Oh, how unlike those black chimney-pots in St. Albans Place, London, on which these weary eyes are accustomed to look. "It must be all happiness here, Ponto," said I, flinging myself down into the snug bergère, and inhaling such a delicious draught of country air as all the millefleurs Mr. Atkinson's shop cannot impart to any the most expensive pocket-handkerchief. "Nice place, isn't it?" said Ponto. "Quiet and unpretending. I like everything quiet. You've not brought your valet with you? Stripes will arrange your dressing things." And that functionary, entering at the same time, proceeded to gut my portmanteau, and to lay out the black kerseyme, the rich cut velvet Genoa waistcoat, the white choker, and other polite articles of evening costume, with great gravity and dispatch. A great dinner party, thinks I to myself, seeing these preparations, and not perhaps displeased at the idea that some of the best people in the neighbourhood were coming to see me. "Hark! There's the first bell ringing," said Ponto, moving away, and in fact a clamorous harbinger of victuals began clanging from the stable turret, and announced the agreeable fact that dinner would appear in half an hour. If the dinner is as grand as the dinner bell, thought I, faith, I am in good quarters, and had leisure during the half-hour's interval not only to advance my own person to the utmost polish of elegance which it is capable of receiving, to admire the pedigree of the Pontos hanging over the chimney, and the Ponto crest and arms emblazoned upon the washstand basin and jug, but to make 1,000 reflections on the happiness of a country life, upon the innocent friendliness and cordiality of rustic intercourse, and to sigh for an opportunity of retiring like Ponto to my own fields, to my own vine and fig tree, with placens uxor in me dominus, and a half-score of sweet young pledges of affection sporting round my paternal knee. Clang! At the end of 30 minutes, dinner bell number 2 pealed from the adjacent turret. I hastened downstairs, expecting to find a score of healthy country folk in the drawing-room. There was only one person there, a tall and Roman-nosed lady, glistering over with bulges in deep mourning. She rose, advanced 2 steps, made a majestic curtsy, during which all the bulges in her awful head-dress began to twiddle and quiver, and then said, "Mr. Snob, we are very happy to see you at the Evergreens," and heaved a great sigh. This, then, was Mrs. Major Ponto, to whom, making my very best bow, I replied that I was very proud to make her acquaintance, as also that of so charming a place as the Evergreens. Another sigh. "We are distantly related, Mr. Snob," she said, shaking her melancholy head. "Poor dear Lord Rub-a-Dub!" "Oh," said I, not knowing what the deuce Mrs. Major Ponto meant. "Major Ponto told me that you were the Leicestershire's Snobs, a very old family, and related to Lord Snobbington, who married Laura Rub-a-Dub, who is a cousin of mine, as was her poor dear father, for whom we are mourning. What a seizure! Only 63, and apoplexy quite unknown until now in our family. In life we are in death, Mr. Snob. Does Lady Snobbington bear the deprivation well?" "Why, really, madam, I don't know," I replied, more and more confused. As she was speaking I heard a sort of cloop, by which well-known sound I was aware that somebody was opening a bottle of wine, and Ponto entered, in a huge white neckcloth and a rather shabby black suit. "My love," Mrs. Major Ponto said to her husband, "we were talking about our cousin. Poor dear Lord Rub-a-Dub. His death has placed some of the first families in England in mourning. Does Lady Rub-a-Dub keep her house in Hill Street, do you know?" I didn't know, but I said, "I believe she does," at a venture, and, looking down to the drawing-room table, I saw the inevitable, abominable, maniacal, absurd, disgusting peerage open on the table, interleaved with annotations, and open at the article Snobbington. "Dinner is served," says Stripes, flinging open the door, and I gave Mrs. Major Ponto my arm. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 25. A Visit to some Country Snobs. Of the dinner to which we now sat down, I am not going to be a severe critic. The mahogany I hold to be inviolable, but this I will say, that I prefer sherry to Marsala when I can get it, and the latter was the wine of which I have no doubt I heard the cloop just before dinner. Nor was it particularly good of its kind, however. Mrs. Major Ponto did not evidently know the difference, for she called the liqueur Armantadillo during the whole of the repast, and drank but a half glass of it, leaving the rest for the Major and his guest. Stripes was in the livery of the Ponto family, though shabby but gorgeous in the extreme. Lots of magnificent worsted lace and livery buttons of a very notable size. The honest fellow's hands, I remarked, were very large and black, and a fine odour of the stable was wafted about the room as he moved to and fro in his ministration. I should have preferred a clean maid servant, but the sensations of the Londoners are too acute, perhaps, on these subjects, and a faithful John, after all, is more genteel. From the circumstance of the dinner being composed of pig's head, mock turtle soup, of pig's fry and roast ribs of pork, I am led to imagine that one of Ponto's black Hampshires had been sacrificed a short time previous to my visit. It was an excellent and comfortable repast, only there was a rather sameness to it, certainly. I made a similar remark the next day. During the dinner, Mrs. Ponto asked me many questions regarding the nobility, my relatives. When Lady Angelina Skeggs would come out, and if the Countess her mamma, this was said with much archness and he-heing, still wore that extraordinary purple hair dye, whether my Lord Guttlebury kept, beside his French chef, and an English cordon bleu for the roasts, an Italian for the confectionery, who attended at Lady Clapperclaw's conversationy, and whether Sir John Champion's Thursday mornings were pleasant. Was it true that Lady Carabas, wanting to pawn her diamonds, found that they were paste, and that the Marquis had disposed of them beforehand? How was it that Snuffin, the great tobacco merchant, broke off the marriage which was on the tapis between him and their second daughter? And was it true that a mulatto lady came over from the Havana and forbade the match? Upon my word, madam, I had begun, and was going on to say that I didn't know one word about all these matters which seemed so to interest Mrs. Major Ponto, when the Major, giving me a tread or stamp with his large foot under the table, said, come on, Snob, my boy, we are all titled, you know. We know you're one of the fashionable people about town. We saw your name at Lady Clapperclaw's soirees, and the champagne breakfast, and as for the rub-a-dubs, of course, as relations. Oh, of course I dine there twice a week, I said, and then I remembered that my cousin Humphrey Snob of the Middle Temple is a great frequenter of genteel societies, and to have seen his name in the Morning Post at the tag end of several party lists. So, taking the hint, I am ashamed to say that I indulged Mrs. Major Ponto with a deal of information about the first families in England, such as would astonish those great personages if they knew it. I described to her most accurately the 3 reigning beauties of last season at Almack's, told her in confidence that his Grace the D. of W. was going to be married the day after his statue was put up, that his Grace the D. of D. was also about to lead the 4th daughter of the Archduke Stephen to the hymeneal altar, and talked to her, in a word, just in the style of Mrs. Gore's last fashionable novel. Mrs. Major was quite fascinated by this brilliant conversation. She had begun to trot out scraps of French, just for all the world as they do in the novels, and kissed her hand to me quite graciously, telling me to come soon to café, un petit musique au salon, with which she tripped off like an elderly fairy. Shall I open a bottle of port, or do you ever drink such a thing as Hollands and water? Says Ponto, looking ruefully at me. This was a very different style of thing to what I had been led to expect from him at our smoking room at the club, where he swaggers about his horses and his cellar, and slapping me on the shoulder used to say, come down to Mangelwurzelshire, Snob, my boy, and I'll give you as good a day's shooting and as good a glass of claret as any in this country. Well, said I like Hollands much better than port, and gin even better than Hollands. This was lucky. It was gin, and Stripes brought in hot water on a splendid plated tray. The jingling of a harp and piano soon announced that Mrs. Ponto's un peu de musique had commenced, and the smell of the stable again entering the dining room, in the person of Stripes, summoned us to café and a little concert. She beckoned me with a winning smile to the sofa, on which she made room for me, and where we could command a fine view of the backs of the young ladies who were performing the musical entertainment. Very broad backs they were, too, strictly according to the present mode, for crinoline or its substitutes is not an expensive luxury, and young people in the country can afford to be in the fashion at very trifling charges. Miss Emily Ponto at the piano, and her sister Maria at that somewhat exploded instrument, the harp, were in light blue dresses that looked all flounce, and spread out like Mr. Green's balloon when inflated. "Brilliant touch Emily has, and what a fine arm Maria's is," Miss Ponto remarked good naturedly, pointing out the merits of her daughters, and waving her own arm in such a way as to show that she was not a little satisfied with the beauty of that member. I observed that she had about 9 bracelets and bangles, consisting of chains and padlocks, the Major's miniature, and a variety of brass serpents with fiery ruby or tender turquoise eyes, writhing up to her elbow almost, in the most profuse contortions. You recognize those polkas? They were played at the Devonshire house on the 23rd of July, the day of the grand fête. So I said yes, I knew 'em quite intimately, and began wagging my head as if in acknowledgment of those old friends. When the performance was concluded, I had the felicity of a presentation and conversation with the 2 tall and scraggy Miss Pontos, and Miss Wirt, the governess, sat down to entertain us with variations on "Sich a getting up the stairs." They were determined to be in the fashion. For the performance of "Getting up the stairs" I have no other name but that it was a stunner. First Miss Wirt, with great deliberation, played the original and beautiful melody, cutting it, as it were, out of the instrument, and firing off each note so loud, clear, and sharp, that I am sure Stripes must have heard it in the stable. "What a finger!" says Mrs. Ponto. And indeed it was a finger, as knotted as a turkey's drumstick, and splaying all over the piano. When she had banged out the tune slowly, she began a different manner of getting up the stairs, and did so with a fury and swiftness quite incredible. She spun up the stairs, she whirled up the stairs, she galloped up the stairs, she rattled up the stairs, and then, having got the tune to the top landing as though it were, she hurled it down again shrieking to the bottom floor, where it sank in a crash as if exhausted by the breathless rapidity of the descent. Then Miss Wirt played "Getting Up the Stairs" with the most pathetic and ravishing solemnity. Plaintive moans and sobs issued from the keys. You wept, you trembled, as though you were getting up the stairs. Miss Wirt's hands seemed to faint and wail and die in variations. Again, and she went up with a savage clang and rush of trumpets, as if Miss Wirt was storming a breach, and although I knew nothing of music, as I sat and listened with my mouth open to this wonderful display, my café grew cold, and I wondered the windows did not crack and the chandelier start out of the beam at the sound of this earthquake of a piece of music. "Glorious creature, isn't she?" said Mrs. Ponto. "Squirtz's favourite pupil. Inestimable to have such a creature. Lady Carabas would give her eyes for her. A prodigy of accomplishments. Thank you, Miss Wirt." And the young ladies gave a heave and a gasp of admiration, a deep, breathing, gushing sound, such as you hear at church when the sermon comes to a full stop. Miss Wirt put her 2 great double-knuckled hands round the waist of her 2 pupils, and said, "My dear children, I hope you will be able to play it soon as well as your poor little governess. When I lived with the Dursinanes, it was dear Duchess's favourite, and Lady Barbara and Lady Jane Macbeth learned it. It was while hearing Jane play that I remember that dear Lord Castletoddy first fell in love with her, and though he is but an Irish peer, with not more than 15,000 a year, I persuaded Jane to have him. Do you know Castletoddy, Mr. Snob? Round Towers, Sweet Place Country, Mayo. Old Lord Castletoddy, the present lord was then Lord Inishowen, was a most eccentric old man. They say he was mad. I heard His Royal Highness the poor Duke of Sussex, such a man, my dears, but alas, addicted to smoking. I heard His Royal Highness say to the Marquis of Anglesey, I am sure that Castletoddy is mad. But Inishowen wasn't in marrying my sweet Jane, though the dear child had but her £10,000 pour tout partage. Most invaluable person, whispered Mrs. Major Ponto to me. He has lived in the very highest society, and I, who would be accustomed to see the governess bullied in the world, was delighted to find this one ruling the roast, and to think that even the majestic Miss Ponto bent before her. As for my pipe, so to speak, it went out at once. I haven't a word to say against a woman who was intimate with every duchess in the Red Book. She wasn't the Rosebud, but she had been near it. She had rubbed shoulders with the great, and about those we talked all the evening incessantly, and about the fashions, and about the court, until bedtime came. And are there snobs in this Elysium? I exclaimed, jumping into the lavender-perfumed bed. Porto's snoring boomed from the neighbouring bedroom in reply. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 26 on some country snobs. Something like a journal of the proceedings at the Evergreens may be interesting to those foreign readers of Punch who want to know the customs of an English gentleman's family and household. There's plenty of time to keep the journal. Piano strumming begins at 6 o'clock in the morning. It lasts until breakfast, but with a minute's intermission, when the instrument changes hands, and Miss Emily practises in place of her sister, Miss Maria. In fact, the confounded instrument never stops when the young ladies are at their lessons. Miss Wirt hammers away at those stunning variations, and keeps her magnificent finger in exercise. I asked this great creature in what other branches of education she instructed her pupils. The modern languages, says she modestly, French, German, Spanish, and Italian, Latin, and the rudiments of Greek if desired. English, of course, the practice of elocution, geography, and astronomy, and the use of the globes. Algebra, but only as far as quadratic equations, for a poor ignorant female, you know, Mr. Snob, cannot be expected to know everything. Ancient and modern history no young woman can be without, and of these I make my beloved pupils perfect mistresses. Botany, geology, and mineralogy I consider as amusements, and with these I assure you we manage to pass the days at the Evergreens not unpleasantly. Only these, thought I, what an education! But I looked in one of Miss Porto's manuscript songbooks, and found 5 faults of French in 4 words, and in a waggish mood, asking Miss Wirt whether Dante Alighieri was so called because he was born at Algiers, received a smiling answer in the affirmative, which made me rather doubt about the accuracy of Miss Wirt's knowledge. When the above little morning occupations are concluded, these unfortunate young women perform what they call calisthenic exercises in the garden. I saw them to-day, without any crinoline, pulling the garden roller. Dear Mrs. Ponto was in the garden too, and as limp as her daughters. in a faded bandeau of hair, in a battered bonnet, in a holland pinafore and patterns on a broken chair, snipping leaves off a vine. Mrs. Ponto measures many yards about in an evening. Yea, heavens, what a guy she is in that skeleton morning costume! Besides Stripes, they keep a boy called Thomas or Tummus. Tummus works in the garden or about the pigsty and stable. Thomas wears a page's costume of eruptive buttons. When anybody calls and Stripes is out of the way, Tummus flings himself like mad into Thomas's clothes, and comes out metamorphosed like Harlequin in the pantomime. Today, as Mrs. P. was cutting the grapevine, as the young ladies were at the roller, down comes Tummus like a roaring whirlwind, with Missus, there's company coming. Away scurry the young ladies from the roller, down comes Mrs. P. from the old chair, off flies Tummus to change his clothes, and in an incredibly short space of time, Sir John Hawbuck, my Lady Hawbuck, and Master Hugh Hawbuck are introduced into the garden, with brazen effrontery by Thomas, who says, "Please, Sir Jan and my lady, to walk this year way. I know Missus is in the rose garden." And there, sure enough, she was, in a pretty little garden bonnet, with beautiful curling ringlets, with the smartest of aprons and the freshest of pearl-coloured gloves. This amazing woman was in the arms of her dearest Lady Hawbuck. Dearest Lady Hawbuck, how good of you! Always among my flowers. Can't live away from them. Sweets to the sweet, hum, ha, ha, says Sir John Hawbuck, who piques himself on his gallantry, and says nothing without a hum, a ha, ha. "Where'th your pinafore?" cries Master Hugh. "We thaw you in it over the wall, didn't we, Pa?" "Hum, ha, ha!" burst out Sir John, dreadfully alarmed. "Where's Ponto? Why wasn't he at quarter sessions? How are his birds this year? Mrs. Ponto, have those Carabas pheasants done any harm to your wheat? Hum, ha, ha!" And all this while he was making the most ferocious and desperate signals to his youthful heir. "Well, she wath in her pinafore, wathn't thee, Ma?" said Hugh, quite unabashed, which question Lady Hawbuck turned away with a sudden query regarding her dear darling daughters, and the enfant terrible was removed by his father. "I hope you weren't disturbed by the music," Ponto says. "My girls, you know, practise 4 hours a day, you know. Must do it, you know. Absolutely necessary. As for me, you know, I'm an early man, and in my farm every morning at 5. No laziness for me." The facts are these. Ponto goes to sleep directly after dinner on entering the drawing room, and wakes up when the ladies leave off practice at 10. From 7 till 10, from 10 till 5, is a very fair allowance of slumber for a man who says he's not a lazy man. It is my private opinion that when Ponto retires to what is called his study, he sleeps too. He locks himself up there daily 2 hours with the newspaper. I saw the Hawbuck scene out of the study which commands the garden. It's a curious object, that study. Ponto's library mostly consists of boots. He and Stripes have important interviews here of mornings, when the potatoes are discussed, or the fate of the calf ordained, or sentence passed on the pig, etc. All the Major's bills are docketed on the study table, and displayed like a lawyer's briefs. Here, too, lie displayed his hooks, knives, and other gardening irons, his whistles and strings of spare buttons. He has a drawer of endless brown paper for parcels, and another containing a prodigious and never failing supply of string. What a man can want with so many gig whips I can never conceive. These and fishing rods and landing nets and spurs and boot trees and balls for horses, and surgical instruments for the same, and favourite pots of shiny blacking with which he paints his own shoes in the most elegant manner, and buckskin gloves stretched out on their trees, and his gorget sash and sabre of the horse marines, with his boot hooks underneath in atrophy, and the family medicine chest, and in a corner the very rod with which he used to whip his son, Wellesley Ponto, when a boy. Wellesley never entered the study but for that awful purpose. All these, with Moggs' Road Book, the Gardener's Chronicle, and a backgammon board, form the Major's library. Under the trophy there's a picture of Mrs. Ponto in a light blue dress and train, and no waist when she was first married. A fox's brush lies over the frame, and serves to keep the dust off that work of art. My library's small, says Ponto, with the most amazing impudence, but well selected, my boy, well selected. I have been reading the History of England all the morning. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Wallichem. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 27. A Visit to some Country Snobs. We had the fish, which, as a kind reader may remember, I had brought down in a delicate attention to Mrs. Ponto, to variegate the repast of next day, and cod and oyster sauce, twice laid salt cod, and scalloped oysters, formed part of the bill of fare, until I began to fancy that the Ponto family, like our late revered monarch George II, had a fancy for stale fish, and about this time, the pig being consumed, we began upon a sheep. But how shall I forget the solemn splendour of a second course, which was served up in great state by Stripes in a silver dish and cover, a napkin round his dirty thumbs, and consisted of a landrail, not much bigger than a corpulent sparrow. "My love, will you take any game?" says Ponto, with prodigious gravity, and stuck his fork into the little mouthful of an island in the silver sea. Stripes, too, at intervals, dribbled out the marsala with a solemnity which would have done honour to a duke's butler. The Barmecide's dinner to Schacabac was only 1 degree removed from these solemn banquets. As there were plenty of pretty country places close by, a comfortable country town, with good houses of gentlefolks, a beautiful old parsonage, close to the church whither we went, and where the Carabas family have their ancestral carves and monumented Gothic pew, and every appearance of good society in the neighbourhood, I rather wondered we were not enlivened by the appearance of some of the neighbours at Evergreens, and asked about them. "We can't, in our position of life, we can't well associate with the attorney's family, as I leave you to suppose," says Mrs. Ponto confidentially. "Of course not," I answered, though I didn't know why. "And the doctor?" said I. "A most excellent worthy creature," says Mrs. P. "Saved Maria's life. Really a learned man. But what can one do in one's position? One may ask one's medical man to one's table, certainly. But his family, my dear Mr. Snob—" "Half a dozen little gallipots," interposed Miss Word, the governess. And the young ladies laughed in chorus. "We only live with the county families," Miss Word continued, tossing up her head. Author's note. I have since heard that this aristocratic lady's father was a livery button-maker in St. Martin's Lane, where he met with misfortunes, and his daughter acquired her taste for heraldry. But it may be told to her credit that out of her earnings she has kept the bed-ridden old bankrupt in great comfort and secrecy in Pentonville, and furnished her brother's outfit for the cadetship which her patron, Lord Swigglebiggle, gave her when he was at the Board of Control. I have this information from a friend. To hear Miss Word herself, you would fancy that her papa was a Rothschild, and that the markets of Europe were convulsed when he went into the Gazette. End of Auster's note. The Duke is abroad. We are at feud with the Carabases. The Ringwood don't come down till Christmas. In fact, nobody's here till the hunting season. Positively nobody. Whose is the large red house just outside of the town? What? The Chateau Gallico? That purse-browed ex-linen-draper, Mr. Yardley, with the yellow liveries and the wife in red velvet? How can you, my dear Mrs. Snob, be so satirical? The impertinence of those people is really something quite overwhelming. Well, then, there is the parson, Dr. Chrysostom. He's a gentleman, at any rate." At this Mrs. Ponto looked at Miss Word. After their eyes had met, and they had wagged their heads at each other, they looked up to the ceiling. So did the young ladies. They thrilled. It was evident I had said something very terrible. "Another black sheep in the church?" thought I, with a little sorrow, for I don't care to own that I have a respect for the cloth. I hope there's nothing wrong?" "Wrong?" says Mrs. P., clasping her hands with a tragic air. "Oh!" says Miss Word, and the two girls gasping in chorus. "Well," says I, "I'm very sorry for it. I never saw a nicer-looking old gentleman, or a better school, or heard a better sermon." "He used to preach those sermons in the surplice," hissed out Mrs. Ponto. "He's Puseyite, Mr. Snob." "Heavenly powers!" says I, admiring the pure art of these female theologians, and strive scheming with the tea. It's so weak that no wonder Ponto's sleep isn't disturbed by it. Of mornings we used to go out shooting. We had Ponto's own fields to sport over, where we got the landrail, and the non-preserved part of the Harbuck property, and one evening in a stubble of Ponto skirting the Caribous woods, we got among some pheasants, and had some real sport. I shot a hen, I know, greatly to my delight. "Back it," says Ponto in rather a hurried manner, "and here's somebody coming." So I pocketed the bird. "You infernal poaching thieves!" roars out a man from the hedge in the garb of a gamekeeper. "I wish I could catch you on this side of the hedge. I'd put a brace of barrels into you, that I would." "Curse that snapper!" says Ponto, moving off. "He's always watching me like a spy." "Carry off the birds, you sneaks, and sell 'em in London," roars the individual, who it appears was a keeper of Lord Caribous. "You'll get 6 shillings a brace for 'em." "You know the price of 'em well enough, and so does your master too, you scoundrel," says Ponto, still retreating. "We kill 'em on our ground," cries Mr. Snapper. "We don't set traps for other people's bird. We're no decoy ducks. We're no sneaking poachers. We don't shoot hens, like that 'ere cockney who's got the tail of one a-sticking out of his pocket. Only just come across the hedge, that's all." "I tell you what," says Stripes, who was out with us as keeper this day. In fact, he's keeper, coachman, gardener, valet, and bailiff, with Thomas under him. "If you'll come across John Snapper and take your coat off, I'll give you such a whopping as you've never had since the last time I did it at Wattlebury Fair." "Whoop on your own weight," Mr. Snapper said, whistling his dogs and disappearing into the wood. And so we came out of this controversy rather victoriously. But I began to alter my preconceived ideas of rural felicity. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 28 on some country snobs. "Be hanged to your aristocrats," Ponto said, in some conversation we had regarding the family at Carabas, between whom and the Evergreens there was a feud. "When I first came into the country, it was the year before Sir John Buff contested in the Blue interest, the Marquis, then Lord St. Michael's, who, of course, was Orange to the core, paid me and Mrs. Ponto such attentions that I fairly confess that I was taken in by the old humbug, and thought that I'd met with a rare neighbour. Gad, sir, we used to get pines from Carabas, and pheasants from Carabas, and it was 'Ponto, when will you come over and shoot?' and 'Ponto, our pheasants want thinning,' and my lady would insist upon her dear Mrs. Ponto coming over to Carabas to sleep, and put me I don't know to what expense for turbans and velvet gowns for my wife's toilet. Well, sir, the election takes place, and though I was always a Liberal, personal friendship of course induces me to plump for St. Michael's, who comes in at the head of the poll. Next year Mrs. P. insists upon going to town, with lodging in Clarges Street, at £10 a week, with a hired brougham, and new dresses for herself and the girls, and the deuce and all to pay. Our first cards were to Carabas House. My ladies are returned by a great big flunkey, and I leave you to fancy my poor Betsy's discomfiture as the lodging house maid took in the cards, and Lady St. Michael's drives away, though she actually saw us at the drawing room window. Would you believe it, sir, that though we called 4 times afterward, those infernal aristocrats never returned our visit? That though Lady St. Michael gave 9 dinner parties and 4 déjeuners at season, she never asked us to one? And that she cut us dead at the opera, though Betsy was nodding to her the whole night? We wrote to her for tickets for Almack's. She writes to say that all hers were promised, and said, in the presence of Wiggins, her lady's maid, who told it to Diggs, my wife's woman, that she couldn't conceive how people in our station of life could so far forget themselves as to wish to appear in any such place. Go to Castle Carabas? I'd sooner die than set my foot in the house of that impertinent, insolvent, insolent jackanapes, and I hold him in scorn. After this Ponto gave me some private information regarding Lord Carabas's pecuniary affairs, and how he owed money all over the county, how Jukes the carpenter was utterly ruined and couldn't get a shilling of his bill, how Biggs the butcher hanged himself for the same reason, how the 6 big footmen never received a guinea of wages, and Snoffle the state coachman actually took off his blown glass wig of ceremony and flung it at Lady Carabas's feet on the terrace before the castle. All which stories, as they are private, I do not think proper to divulge. But these details did not stifle my desire to see the famous mansion of Castle Carabas, nay, possibly excite my interest to know more about that lordly house and its owners. At the entrance of the park there are a pair of great gaunt mildewed lodges, mouldy Doric temples with black chimney pots in the finest classic taste, and the gates of course are surmounted by the Chabots, the well known supporters of the Carabas family. Give the lodgekeeper a shilling, says Ponto, who drove me near to it in his 4-wheeled cruelty chaise. I warrant it's the first piece of ready money he has received for some time. I don't know whether there was any foundation for this sneer, but the gratuity was received with a curtsy, and the gate opened for me to enter. Poor old portress, says I inwardly, you little know that it is the historian of Snobs whom you let in. The gates were passed. A damp green stretch of park spread right and left immeasurably, confined by a chilly grey wall, and a damp, long, straight road between 2 huge rows of moist, dismal lime trees leads up to the castle. In the midst of the park there is a great black tank or lake, bristling over with rushes, and here and there covered over with patches of pea soup. A shabby temple rises on an island in this delectable lake, which is approached by a rotten barge that lies at roost in a dilapidated boathouse. Clumps of elms and oaks dot over the huge green flat. Every one of them would have been down long since, but that the Marquis is not allowed to cut the timber. Up that long avenue the snobographer walked in solitude. At the 79th tree on the left-hand side, the insolvent butcher hanged himself. I scarcely wondered at the dismal deed, so woeful and sad were the impressions connected with the place, so for a mile and a half I walked alone, and thinking of death. I forgot to say the house is in full view all the way, except when intercepted by the trees on the miserable island in the lake. An enormous red brick mansion, square, vast, and dingy. It is flanked by 4 stone towers with weathercocks. In the midst of the grand façade is a huge Ionic portico, approached by a vast, lonely, ghastly staircase. Rows of black windows, framed in stone, stretch on either side, right and left, 3 stories and 18 windows of a row. You may see a picture of the palace and staircase in The Views of England and Wales, with 4 carved and gilt carriages waiting at the gravel walk, and several parties of ladies and gentlemen in wigs and hoops dotting the fatiguing lines of stairs. But these stairs are made in great houses for people not to ascend. The first Lady Carabas, they are but 80 years in the peerage, if she got out of her gilt coach in a shower, would be wet to the skin before she got half way to the carved Ionic portico, where 4 dreary statues of peace, plenty, piety, and patriotism are the only sentinels. You enter these palaces by back doors. That was the way the Carabases got their peerage, the misanthropic Ponto said after dinner. Well, I rang the bell at a little low side door. It clanged and jingled and echoed for a long, long while, till at length a face as of a housekeeper peered through the door, and as she saw my hand in my waistcoat pocket, opened it. Unhappy, lonely housekeeper, I thought. Is Miss Crusoe in her island more solitary? The door clapped to, and I was in Castle Carabas. The side entrance in all, says the housekeeper. The Alligator hover the mantelpiece was brought home by Admiral St. Michael's when a capting with Lord Hanson. The harms on the chairs is the harms of the Carabas family. The hall was rather comfortable. We went clapping up a clean stone backstair, and then into a back passage cheerfully decorated with a ragged light green Kidderminster, and issued upon the Great 'All. The Great 'All is 72 feet in length, 56 in breadth, and 38 feet high. The carvings of the chimneys, representing the birth of Venus and Hercules and Eyelash, is by Van Chisholm, the most famous sculptor of this Hague and country. The ceiling by Calamanco, representing painting, horticulture, and music. The naked female figure with the barrel organ, introducing George, first Lord Carabas, to the Temple of the Muses. The window ornaments is by Vanderputty, the floor is Patagonian marble, and the chandelier in the centre was presented to Lionel, second Marquis, by Louis XVI, whose head was cut off in the French Revolution. We now enter the South Gallery. 148 in length by 32 in breadth, it is profusely ornamented by the choicest works of art. Sir Andrew Katz, founder of the Carabas family and banker of the Prince of Orange, Kneller. Her present ladyship by Lawrence. Lord St. Michael's by the same. He is represented sitting on a rock in velvet pantaloons. Moses in the bulrushes. The Bull very fine, by Paul Potter. The Toilet of Venus, Fantaschi. Flemish boars drinking, Van Ginnemus. Jupiter and Europa, de Horn. The Grand Junction Canal, Venus by Candletti, and Italian Bandix by Salvator Rosa. And so this worthy woman went on from one room to another, from the blue room to the green, and the green to the grand salon, and the grand salon to the tapestry closet, cracking her list of pictures and wonders, and furtively turning up a corner of a brown Holland to show the colour of the old, faded, seedy, mouldy, dismal hangings. At last we came to her ladyship's bedroom. In the centre of this dreary apartment there is a bed about the size of one of those whizgig temples in which the Janus appears in pantomime. The huge gilt edifice is approached by steps, and so tall that it might be let off in floors for sleeping rooms for all the Carabas family. An awful bed. A murder might be done at one end of that bed, and people sleeping at the other end be ignorant of it. Gracious powers! Fancy little Lord Carabas in a nightcap ascending those steps after putting out the candle. The sight of that seedy and solitary splendour was too much for me. I should go mad were I that lonely housekeeper, in those enormous galleries, in that lonely library, filled up with ghastly folios that nobody dares read, with an inkstand on the centre table like the coffin of a baby, and sad portraits staring at you from the bleak walls with their solemn mouldy eyes. No wonder that Carabas does not come down here often. It would require 2,000 footmen to make the place cheerful. No wonder the coachman resigned his wig, that the masters were insolvent, and the servants perish in this huge, dreary, out at elbow place. A single family has no more right to build itself a temple of that sort than to erect a Tower of Babel. Such a habitation is not decent for a mere mortal man, but after all, I suppose poor Carabas had no choice. Fate put him there as it sent Napoleon to St. Helena. Suppose it had been decreed by nature that you and I should be Marquis? We wouldn't refuse, I suppose, but take Castle Carabas and all, with debts, duns, and mean makeshifts, and shabby pride, and swindling magnificence. Next season, when I read of Lady Carabas's splendid entertainments in the Morning Post, and see the poor old insolvent cantering through the park, I shall have a much tenderer interest in those great people than I have had heretofore. Poor old shabby Snob! Ride on, and fancy the world is still on its knees before the house of Carabas. Give yourself airs, poor old bankrupt Magnifico, who are under money obligations to your flunkeys, and must stoop so as to swindle poor tradesmen. And for us, oh my brother Snobs, oughtn't we to feel happy if our walk through life is more even, and that we are out of the reach of that surprising arrogance and that astounding meanness to which this wretched old victim is obliged to mount and descend? Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 29. A Visit to Some Country Snobs. Notable as my reception had been, under that unfortunate mistake of Mrs. Ponto that I was related to Lord Snobbington, which I was not permitted to correct, it was nothing compared to the bowing and catoing, the raptures and flurry which preceded and welcomed the visit of a real live lord and lord's son, a brother officer of Cornet Wellesley Ponto in the 120th Hussars, who came over with the young cornet from Guttlebury, where their distinguished regiment was quartered. This was my Lord Giles, Lord Saltire's grandson and heir, a very young, short, sandy-haired, and tobacco-smoking nobleman, who cannot have left the nursery very long, and who, though he accepted the honest Major's invitation to the Evergreens in a letter written in a schoolboy handwriting, with a number of faults of spelling, may yet be a very fine classical scholar for what I know, having had his education at Eton, where he and young Ponto were inseparable. At any rate, if he can't write, he has mastered a number of other accomplishments wonderful for one of his age and size. He is one of the best shots and riders in England. He rode his horse Abracadabra, and won the famous Guttlebury steeplechase. He has horses entered at half the races in the country, under other people's names, for the old lord is a strict hand, and will not hear of betting or gambling. He has lost and won such sums of money as my Lord George himself might be proud of. He knows all the stables and all the jockeys, and has all the information, and is a match for the best leg at Newmarket. Nobody was ever known to be too much for him at play or in the stable. Although his grandfather makes him a moderate allowance, by the aid of post obits and convenient friends, he can live in a splendour becoming his rank. He has not distinguished himself in the knocking down of policemen much. He is not big enough for that, but as a light weight his skill is of the very highest order. At billiards he is said to be first rate. He drinks and smokes as much as any two of the biggest officers in his regiment. With such high talents, who can say how far he may not go? He may take to politics as a delassessment, and be Prime Minister after Lord George Bentinck. My young friend Wellesley Ponto is a gaunt and bony youth, with a pale face profusely blotched. From his continually pulling something on his chin, I am led to fancy that he believes he has what is called an imperial growing there. That is not the only tuft that is hunted in the family, by the way. He can't, of course, indulge in those expensive amusements which render his aristocratic comrade so respected. He bets pretty freely when he is in the cash, and rides when somebody mounts him, for he can't afford more than his regulation chargers. At drinking he is by no means inferior. And why do you think he brought his noble friend, Lord Giles, to the Evergreens? Why? Because he intended to ask his mother to order his father to pay his debts, which she couldn't refuse before such an exalted presence. Young Ponto gave me all this information with the most engaging frankness. We are old friends. I used to tip him when he was at school. Gad, says he, are wedgments so doothed expensive? Must hunt, you know. A man couldn't live in the wedgment if he didn't. Meth expenses enough. Must dine at meth, must drink champagne and claret. Ours ain't a port and sherry light infantry mess. Uniform's awful. Fitzschultz, our colonel, will have 'em though. Must be a distinction, you know. At his own expense, Fitzschultz altered the plumes in the men's caps. You called them shaving brushes, Snob, my boy. Most absurd and unjust that attack of yours, by the way. That alteration alone cost him £500. The year before last he horsed the wedgment at an immense expense, and we're called the Queen's own piebalds from that day. Ever seen us on parade? The Emperor Nicholas burst into tears of envy when he saw us at Windsor. And you see, continued my young friend, I brought Giles down with me, as the governor is very sulky about shelling out, just to talk my mother over, who can do anything with him. Giles told her that I was Fitzschultz's favourite of the whole regiment, and gad, she thinks the Horse Guards will give me my troop for nothing. And he humbugged the governor that I was the greatest screw in the army. Ain't that a good dodge? With this Wellesley left me to go and smoke a cigar in the stables with Lord Giles, and make merry over the cattle there under Stripes' superintendence. Young Ponto laughed with his friend at the venerable four-wheeled cruelty chase, but seemed amazed that the latter should ridicule more than an ancient chariot of the build of 1824, emblazoned immensely with the arms of the Pontos and the Snaileys, from which latter distinguished family Mrs. Ponto issued. I found poor Pon in his study among his boots, in such a rueful attitude of despondency, that I could not but remark it. Look at that, says the poor fellow, handing me over a document. It's the second change in uniform since he's been in the army, and yet there's no extravagance about the lad. Lord Giles tells me that he is the most careful youngster in the regiment, God bless him. But look at that. By heavens, Snob, look at that and say how can a man of 900 keep out of the bench? He gave a sob as he handed me the paper across the table, and his old face, and his old corduroys, and his shrunk shooting jacket, and his lean shanks, looked, as he spoke, more miserably haggard, bankrupt, and threadbare. Lieutenant Wellesley Ponto, 120th Queen's Own Piebald Hussars, to Knopf and Stecknadel, Conduit Street, London, L.S.D. Dress jacket, richly laced with gold, £35. Ditto pelisse, ditto and trimmed with sable, £60. Undress jacket, trimmed with gold, £15, 15s. Ditto pelisse, £30. Dress pantaloons, £12. Ditto overalls, gold lace on sides, £6, 6s. Undress ditto, ditto, £5, 5s. Blue braided frock, £14, 14s. Forage cap, £3, 3s. Dress cap, gold lines, plume and chain, £25. Gold barreled sash, £11, 18s. Sword, £11, 11s. Ditto belt and salbachet, £16, 16s. Pouch and belt, £15, 15s. Sword knot, £1, 4s. Cloak, £13, 13s. Valise, £3, 13s. 6d. Regulation saddle, £7, 17s. 6d. Ditto bridle complete, £10, 10s. A dress housing complete, £30. A pair of pistols, £10, 10s. A black sheepskin edged, £6, 18s. Total, £347, 9s.
That evening Mrs. Ponto and her family made their darling Wellesley give a full, true, and particular account of everything that had taken place at Lord Fitzstultz's: how many servants waited at dinner, and how the Ladies Schneider dressed, and what his Royal Highness said when he came down to shoot, and who was there. "What a blessing that boy is to me!" she said, as my pimple-faced young friend moved off to resume smoking operations with Giles in the now vacant kitchen. And poor Ponto's dreary and desperate look, shall I ever forget that? Oh, you parents and guardians! Oh, you men and women of sense in England! Oh, you legislators about to assemble in Parliament! Read over that tailor's bill above printed, read over that absurd catalogue of insane gimmicks and madman's tomfoolery, and say, how are you ever to get rid of snobbishness when society does so much for its education? £340 for a young chap's saddle and breeches. Before George, I would rather be a Hottentot or a Highlander. We laugh at poor Jocko the monkey, dancing in uniform, or at poor Jeemes the flunkey, with his quivering calves and plush tights, or at the nigger Marquis of Marmalade, dressed out with sabre and epaulets, and giving himself the airs of a field marshal. Lo, is not one of the Queen's piebalds in full fig as great and foolish a monster? End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of the Book of Snobs by W.M. Thackeray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Snobs by W.M. Thackeray, Chapter 30. On Some Country Snobs. At last came that fortunate day at the Evergreens when I was to be made acquainted with some of the county families with whom only people of Ponto's rank condescended to associate. And now, although poor Ponto had just been so cruelly made to bleed on occasion of his son's new uniform, and though he was in the direst and most cut-throat spirits with an overdrawn account of the bankers and other pressing evils of poverty, although a tenpenny bottle of Marsala and an awful parsimony presided generally at his table, yet the poor fellow was obliged to assume the most frank and jovial air of cordiality, and all the covers being removed from the hangings, and new dresses being procured for the young ladies, and the family plate being unlocked and displayed, the house and all within assumed a benevolent and festive appearance. The kitchen fires began to blaze, the good wine ascended from the cellar, a professed cook actually came over from Guttlebury to compile culinary abominations. Stripes was in a new coat, and so was Ponto, for a wonder, and Tummus's button-suit was worn en permanence. And all this to show off the little lord, thinks I. All this in honour of a stupid little cigarified cornet of dragoons who can barely write his name, while an eminent and profound moralist like somebody is fobbed off with cold mutton and relays of pig. Well, well, a martyrdom of cold mutton is just bearable. I pardon Mrs. Ponto, from my heart I do, especially as I wouldn't turn out of the best bedroom in spite of all her hints, but held my ground in the chintz tester, vowing that Lord Gules as a young man was quite small and hearty enough to make himself comfortable elsewhere. The great Ponto party was a very august one. The Hawbucks came in their family coach, with the blood-red band emblazoned all over it, and their man in yellow livery waited in country fashion at table, only to be exceeded in splendour by the Hipsleys, the opposition baronet, in light blue. The old ladies Fitzgibbon drove over in their little old chariot with the fat black horses, the fat coachman, the fat footman. Why are dowagers as horses and footmen always fat? And soon after these personages had arrived with their auburn fronts and red beaks and turbans, came the Honourable and Reverend Lionel Pettipois, who with General and Mrs. Sago formed the rest of the party. Lord and Lady Frederick Howlet were asked, but they have friends at Ivybush, Mrs. Ponto told me, and that very morning the Castle Haggards sent an excuse, as her ladyship had a return of the quinsy. Between ourselves, Lady Castle Haggard's quinsy always comes on when there is dinner at the Evergreens. If the keeping of polite company could make a woman happy, surely my kind hostess, Mrs. Ponto, was on that day a happy woman. Every person present, except the unlucky impostor who pretended to a connection with the Snobbington family and General Sago, who had brought home I don't know how many lakhs of rupees from India, was related to the peerage or the baronetage. Mrs. P. had her heart's desire. If she had been an earl's daughter herself, could she have expected better company? And her family were in the oil trade at Bristol, as all her friends very well know. What I complained of in my heart was not the dining, which for this once was plentiful and comfortable enough, but the prodigious dulness of the talking part of the entertainment. Oh, my beloved brother snobs of the city! If we love each other no better than our country brethren, at least we amuse each other more. If we bore ourselves, we are not called upon to go 10 miles to do it. For instance, the Hipsleys came 10 miles from the south, and the Hawbucks 10 miles from the north of the Evergreens, and were magnates in 2 different divisions of the county of Mangle-Wurzelsshire. Hipsley, who was an old baronet with a bothered estate, did not care to show his contempt for Hawbuck, who is a new creation and rich. Hawbuck, on his part, gives himself patronizing airs to General Sago, who looks upon the Pontos as little better than paupers. Old Lady Blanche, says Ponto, I hope will leave something to her goddaughter, my second girl. We've all of us half poisoned ourselves with taking her physic. Lady Blanche and Lady Rose Fitzague have, the first, a medical, and the second a literary turn. I'm inclined to believe the former had a wet compress around her body on the occasion when I had the happiness of meeting her. She doctors everybody in the neighbourhood of which she is the ornament, and has tried everything on her own person. She went into court and testified publicly her faith in St. John Long. She swore by Dr. Buchan. She took quantities of Gamboge's universal medicine and whole boxfuls of Parr's life pills. She has cured a multiplicity of headaches by Squinstone's eye snuff. She wears a picture of Hahnemann in her bracelet, and a lock of Priesnitz hair in a brooch. She talked about her own complaints and those of her confidante for the time being to every lady in the room successively, from our hostess down to Miss Wirt, taking them into corners and whispering about bronchitis, hepatitis, St. Vitus, neuralgia, cephalalgia, and so forth. I observed poor fat Lady Hawbuck in a dreadful alarm, after some communication regarding the state of her daughter Miss Lady Hawbuck's health, and Mrs. Sago turned quite yellow, and put down her 3rd glass of Madeira at a warning glance from Lady Blanche. Lady Rose talked literature and about the book club at Guttlebury, and is very strong in voyages and travels. She has a prodigious interest in Borneo, and displayed a knowledge of the history of the Punjab and Kaffirland that does credit to her memory. Old General Sago, who sat perfectly silent and plethoric, roused up as from a lethargy when the former country was mentioned, and gave the company his story about a hog hunt and ram-jugger. I observed her ladyship treated with something like contempt her neighbour the Reverend Lionel Pettipois, a young divine, whom you may track through the country by little awakening books, at half a crown 100, which dribble out of his pockets wherever he goes. I saw him give Miss Wirt a sheaf of The Little Washerwoman on Putney Common, and to Miss Hawbuck a couple of dozen of Meat in the Tray, or The Young Butcher Boy Rescued. And on paying a visit to Guttlebury Gaol, I saw 2 notorious fellows waiting their trial there and temporarily occupied with a game of cribbage, to whom his reverence offered a tract as he was walking over Crackshins Common, and who robbed him of his purse, umbrella, and cambric handkerchief, leaving him the tracts to distribute elsewhere. End of Chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 31. A Visit to Some Country Snobs. Why, dear Mr. Snob, said a young lady of rank and fashion, to whom I present my best compliments, if you found everything so snobbish at the Evergreens, if the pig bored you, and the mutton was not to your liking, and Mrs. Ponto was a humbug, and Miss Wirt a nuisance with her abominable piano practice, why did you stay so long? Ah, miss, what a question! Have you never heard of gallant British soldiers storming batteries, of doctors passing nights in plague wards of lazarettos, and other instances of martyrdom? What do you suppose induced gentlemen to walk 2 miles up to the batteries of Sabroan, with 150 thundering guns bowling them down by hundreds? Not pleasure, surely? What causes your respected father to quit his comfortable home for his chambers after dinner, and pore over the most dreary law papers until long past midnight? Mademoiselle, duty, which must be done alike by military or legal or literary gents. There's a power of martyrdom in our profession. You won't believe it? Your rosy lips assume a smile of incredulity. a most naughty and odious expression in a young lady's face. Well, then, the fact is that my chambers, number 24, Pump Court, Temple, were being painted by the Honourable Society, and Mrs. Slamkin, my laundress, having occasion to go into Durham to see her daughter, who is married, and has presented her with the sweetest little grandson, a few weeks could not be better spent than in rusticating. But, ah, how delightful Pump Court looked when I revisited its well-known chimney pots! Carrie Loogie, welcome, welcome, O frog and smut! But if you think there is no moral in the foregoing account of the Pontine family, you are, madam, most painfully mistaken. In this very chapter we are going to have the moral. Why, the whole of the papers are nothing but the moral, setting forth as they do the folly of being a snob. You will remark that in the country snobography my poor friend Ponto has been held up almost exclusively for the public gaze. And why? Because we went to no other house? Because other families did not welcome us to their mahogany? No, no. Sir John Hawbuck of the Haws, Sir John Hipsley of Briery Hall, don't shut the gates of hospitality. Of General Sago's Mulligatawny I could speak from experience. And the two old ladies at Guttlesbury, were they nothing? Do you suppose that an agreeable young dog, who shall be nameless, would not be made welcome? Don't you know that people are too glad to see anybody in the country? But those dignified personages do not enter into the scheme of the present work, and are but minor characters of our snob drama, just as in the play kings and emperors are not half so important as many humble persons. The Doge of Venice, for instance, gives way to Othello, who is but a nigger, and the King of France to Falconbridge, who is a gentleman of positively no birth at all. So with the exalted characters above mentioned, I perfectly well recollect that the claret at Hawbuck's was not by any means so good as that of Hipsley's, while, on the contrary, some white hermitage at the Haws (by the way, the butler only gave me half a glass each time) was supernacular. And I remember the conversations, oh, madam, madam, how stupid they were! The subsoil ploughing, the pheasants and poaching, the row about the representation of the country, the Earl of Mangle-Worcestershire being at variance with his relative and nominee, the Honourable Marmaduke Tomnoddy, all these I could put down, had I the mind to violate the confidence of private life, and a great deal of conversation about the weather, the Mangle-Worcestershire hunt, new manures, and eating and drinking, of course. But cui bono? In these perfectly stupid and honourable families there is not that snobbishness which it is our purpose to expose. An ox is an ox, a great, hulking, fat-sided, bellowing, munching beef. He ruminates according to his nature, and consumes his destined portion of turnips or oil cake, until the time comes for his disappearance from the pastures, to be succeeded by other deep-lunged and fat-ribbed animals. Perhaps we do not respect an ox. We rather acquiesce in him. The snob, my dear madam, is the frog that tries to swell himself to ox size. Let us pelt the silly brute out of his folly. Look, I pray you, at the case of my unfortunate friend Ponto. A good-natured, kindly English gentleman, not over-wise, but quite passable, fond of port wine, of his family, of country sports and agriculture, hospitably minded, with as pretty a little patrimonial country house as heart can desire, and £1,000 a year. It is not much, but entre nous people can live for less, and not uncomfortably. For instance, there is the doctor whom Mrs. P. does not condescend to visit. That man educates a mirific family, and is loved by the poor for miles around, and gives them port wine for physic and medicine gratis. and how those people can get on with their pittance, as Mrs. Ponto says, is a wonder to her. Again, there is the clergyman, Dr. Chrysostom. Mrs. P. says they quarrelled about Puseyism, but I am given to understand it was because Mrs. C. had the paw of her at the Haws. You may see what the value of his living is any day in the Clerical Guide, but you don't know what he gives away. Even Pettipolis allows that, in whose eyes the doctor's surplice is a scarlet abomination, and so does Pettipolis do his duty in his way, and administer not only his tracts and his talk, but his money and his means to his people. As a lord's son, by the way, Mrs. Ponto is uncommonly anxious that he should marry either of the girls whom Lord Giles does not intend to choose. Well, although Pond's income would make up almost as much as that of these three worthies put together, oh, my dear madam, see what in hopeless penury the poor fellow lives. What tenant can look to his forbearance? What poor man can hope for his charity? Master's the best of men, honest Stripes says, and when we was in the rigiment a more free-handed chap didn't live. But the way in which Mrs. do Sayu, I wonder the young ladies is alive, that I do. They live upon a fine governess and fine masters, and have clothes made by Lady Carabas's own milliner, and their brother rides with earls to cover, and only the best people in the country visit at the Evergreens, and Mrs. Ponto thinks herself a paragon of wives and mothers, and a wonder of the world for doing all this misery and humbug and snobbishness on 1,000 a year. What an inexpressible comfort it was, my dear madam, when Stripes put down my portmanteau in the four-wheeled chaise, and poor P, on being touched with sciatica, drove me over to Carabas Arms at Guttlebury, where we took leave. There were some bagmen there in the commercial room, and one talked about the house he represented, and another about his dinner, and a third about the inns on the road, and so forth. A talk not very wise, but honest and to the purpose, about as good as that of the country gentleman, and oh, how much pleasanter than listening to Miss Wirt's show pieces on the piano, and Mrs. Ponto's genteel cackle about the fashion and the country families. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording, or LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Mallichem. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 32. Snobium Gatherum. When I see the great effect which these papers are producing on an intelligent public, I have a strong hope that before long we shall have a regular snob department in the newspapers, just as we have the police courts and the court news at present. When a flagrant case of bone-crushing or poor law abuse occurs in the world, who so eloquent as at times to point it out? When a gross instance of snobbishness happens, why should not the indignant journalist call the public attention to that delinquency too? How, for instance, could that wonderful case of the Earl of Mangelwurzel and his brother be examined in the snobbish point of view, let alone the hectoring, the bullying, the vapouring, the bad grammar, the mutual recriminations, lie-givings, challenges, retractions, which abound in the fraternal dispute, put out of the question these points as concerning the individual nobleman and his relative, with whose personal affairs we have nothing to do, and consider how intimately corrupt, how habitually grovelling and mean, how entirely snobbish, in a word, a whole county must be, which can find no better chiefs or leaders than these two gentlemen. We don't want, the great county of Mangelwurzelshire seems to say, that a man should be able to write good grammar, or that he should keep a Christian tongue in his head, or that he should have the commonest decency of temper, or even a fair share of good sense, in order to represent us in Parliament. All we require is, that a man should be recommended to us by the Earl of Mangelwurzelshire, and all that we require of the Earl of Mangelwurzelshire is that he should have 50,000 a year, and hunt the country. Oh, you pride of all Snobland! Oh, you crawling, truckling, self-confessed lackeys and parasites! But this is growing too savage. Don't let us forget our usual amenity, and the tone of playfulness and sentiment with which the beloved reader and writer have pursued their mutual reflections hitherto. Well, snobbishness pervades the little social farce as well as a great state comedy, and the self-same moral is tacked to either. There was, for instance, an account in the papers of a young lady who, misled by a fortune-teller, actually went part of the way to India, as far as Becnic was, I think, in search of a husband who was promised her there. Do you suppose this poor deluded little soul would have left her shop for a man below her in rank, or for anything but a darling of a captain in epaulets and a red coat? It was her snobbish sentiment that misled her, and made her vanities a prey to the swindling fortune-teller. Case 2 was that of Mademoiselle de Saugrenu, the interesting young Frenchwoman with a profusion of jetty ringlets, who lived for nothing at a boarding-house at Gosport, was then conveyed to Fareham Greater, and being there, and lying on the bed of the good old lady her entertainer, the dear girl took occasion to rip open the mattress and steal a cash-box, with which she fled to London. How would you account for the prodigious benevolence exercised towards the interesting young French lady? Was it her jetty ringlets, or her charming face? Bah! Do ladies love others for having faces and black hair? She said she was a relation of de Saugrenu, talked of her ladyship around, and of herself as de Saugrenu. The honest boarding-house people were at her feet at once. Good, honest, simple, Lord-loving children of Snobland. Finally, there was the case of the Right Honourable Mr. Vernon at York. The Right Honourable was the son of a nobleman, and practised on an old lady. He procured from her dinners, money, wearing apparel, spoons, implicit credence, and an entire refit of linen. Then he cast his nets over a family of father, mother, and daughters, one of whom he proposed to marry. The father lent him money, the mother made jams and pickles for him, the daughters vied with each other in cooking dinners for the Right Honourable. And what was the end? One day the traitor fled, with a teapot and a basket full of cold victuals. It was a Right Honourable which baited the hook which gorged all these greedy simple snobs. Would they have been taken in by a commoner? What old lady is there, my dear sir, who would take in you and me, were we ever so ill-to-do, and comfort us, and clothe us, and give us her money and her silver forks? Alas and alas! What mortal man that speaks the truth can hope for such a landlady? And yet all these instances of fond and credulous snobbishness have occurred in the same week's paper with who knows how many score more. Just as we had concluded the above remarks, comes a pretty little note, sealed with a pretty little butterfly, bearing a Northern postmark, and to the following effect: 19th of November. Mr. Punch, taking great interest in your snob papers, we are very anxious to know under what class of that respectable fraternity you would designate us. We are 3 sisters, from 17 to 22. Our father is honestly and truly of a very good family. You will say it is snobbish to mention that, but I wish to state the plain fact. Our maternal grandfather was an earl. Note 1. The introduction of grandpapa is, I fear, snobbish. We can afford to take in a stamped edition of you and all Dickens's works as fast as they come, but we do not keep such a thing as a peerage or even a baronetage in the house. We live with every comfort, excellent cellar, etc., etc. But as we cannot well afford a butler, we have a neat table-maid, though our father was a military man, has travelled much, been in the best society, etc. We have a coachman and helper, but we don't put the latter into buttons, nor make them wait at table, like stripes and Thomas. Note 2. That is as you like. I don't object to buttons in moderations. We are just the same to persons with a handle to their name as to those without it. We wear a moderate modicum of crinoline. Note 3. Quite right. And are never limp. Note 4. Bless you. In the morning. We have good and abundant dinners on china, though we have plate. Note 5. Snobbish, and I doubt whether you ought to dine as well alone as with company. You will be getting 2 good dinners. And just as good when alone as with company. Now, my dear Mr. Punch, will you please give us a short answer in your next number, and I will be so much obliged to you. Nobody knows we are writing to you, not even our father, nor will we ever tease. Note 6. We like to be teased, but tell papa. You again, if you will only give us an answer, just for fun. Now do. If you get as far as this, which is doubtful, you will probably fling it into the fire. If you do, I cannot help it, but I am of a sanguine disposition, and entertain a lingering hope. At all events, I shall be impatient for next Sunday, for you reach us on that day, and I am ashamed to confess we cannot resist opening you in the carriage driving home from church. Note 7. O goddess and stars, what will Captain Gordon and Exeter Hall say to this? I remain, etc., etc., for myself and sisters. Excuse this scrawl, but I always write headlong. Note 8. Dear little enthusiast. P.S. You were rather stupid last week, don't you think? Note 9. You were never more mistaken, miss, in your life. We keep no gamekeeper, and yet have always abundant game for friends to shoot in spite of the poachers. We never write on perfumed paper. In short, I can't help thinking that if you knew us, you would not think us snobs. To this I reply in the following manner. My dear young ladies, I know your post town, and shall be at church there the Sunday after next, when will you please to wear a tulip or some little trifle in your bonnets, so that I may know you. You will recognize me and my dress, a quiet-looking young fellow, in a white top-coat, a crimson satin neckcloth, light blue trousers, with glossy tipped boots, and an emerald breastpin. I shall have a black crape round my white hat, and my usual bamboo cane with a richly gilt knob. I am sorry there will be no time to get up moustaches between now and next week. From 17 to 22, ye gods, what ages! Dear young creatures, I can see you all 3. 17 suits me, as near as my own time of life, but mind I don't say 22 is too old. No, no, and that pretty roguish demure middle one, peace, peace, thou silly little fluttering heart. You snobs, dear young ladies, I will pull any man's nose who says so. There is no harm in being of a good family. You can't help it, poor dears. What's in a name? What's in a handle to it? I confess openly that I should not object to being a duke myself, and between ourselves you might see a worse leg for a garter. You snobs, dear little good-natured things, no, that is, I hope not. I think not. I won't be too confident. None of us should be, that we are not snobs. That very confidence savours of arrogance, and to be arrogant is to be a snob. In all the social gradations from sneak to tyrant, nature has placed the most wondrous and various progeny of snobs. But are there no kindly natures, no tender hearts, no souls humble, simple, and truth-loving? Ponder well on this question, sweet young ladies, and if you can answer it, as no doubt you can, lucky are you, and lucky the respected Herr Papa, and lucky the 3 handsome young gentlemen who are about to become each other's brothers-in-law. End of Chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 33. Snobs and Marriage. Everybody of the middle rank, who walks through this life with a sympathy for his companions on the same journey, at any rate every man who has been jostling in the world for some 3 or 4 lustres, must make no end of melancholy reflections upon the fate of those victims whom society, that is, snobbishness, is immolating every day. With love and simplicity and natural kindness, snobbishness is perpetually at war. People dare not be happy for fear of snobs. People dare not love for fear of snobs. People pine away lonely under the tyranny of snobs. Honest, kindly hearts dry up and die. Gallant, generous lads, blooming with hearty youth, swell into bloated old bachelorhood, and burst and tumble over. Tender girls wither into shrunken decay, and perish solitary, from whom snobbishness has cut off the common claim to happiness and affection with which nature endowed us all. My heart grows sad as I see the blundering tyrant's handiwork. As I behold it, I swell with cheap rage, and glow with fury against the snob. Come down, I say, thou skulking dullness. Come down, thou stupid bully, and give up thy brutal ghost. And I arm myself with the sword and spear, and taking leave of my family, go forth to do battle with that hideous ogre and giant, that brutal despot in Snob Castle, who holds so many gentle hearts in torture and thrall. When Punch is king, I declare there shall be no such thing as old maids and old bachelors. The Reverend Mr. Malthus shall be burned annually instead of Guy Fawkes. Those who don't marry shall go into the workhouse. It shall be a sin for the poorest not to have a pretty girl to love him. The above reflections came to mind after taking a walk with an old comrade, Jack Spiggot by name, who is just passing into the state of old bachelorhood after the manly and blooming youth in which I remember him. Jack was one of the handsomest fellows in England when we entered together in the Highland Buffs, but I quitted the Cuttykilts early, and lost sight of him for many years. Ah, how changed he is from those days! He wears a waistband now, and has begun to dye his whiskers. His cheeks, which were red, are now mottled. His eyes, once so bright and steadfast, are the colour of peeled plovers' eggs. "Are you married, Jack?" says I, remembering how consumedly in love he was with his cousin Letty Lovelace, when the Cuttykilts were quartered at Strathbungo some 20 years ago. "Married? No," says he, "not money enough. Hard enough to keep myself, much more a family on 500 a year. Come to Dickinson's. There's some of the best Madeira in London there, my boy." So we went, and talked over old times. The bill for dinner and wine consumed was prodigious, and the quantity of brandy and water that Jack took showed what a regular boozer he was. "A guinea or 2 guineas. What the devil do I care what I spend for my dinner?" says he. "And Letty Lovelace?" says I. Jack's countenance fell. However, he burst into a loud laugh presently. "Ha! Letty Lovelace!" says he. "She's Letty Lovelace still, but gad, such a wizened old woman. She's as thin as a thread paper. You remember what a figure she had. Her nose has got red and her teeth blue. She's always ill, always quarrelling with the rest of the family, always psalms singing, and always taking pills. Gad, I had a rare escape there. Push round the grog, old boy." Straightway memory went back to the days when Letty was the loveliest of blooming young creatures, when to hear her sing was to make the heart jump into your throat, when to see her dance was better than Montessu or Noble (they were the ballet queens of those days), when Jack used to wear a locket of her hair with a little gold chain round his neck, and, exhilarated with toddy, after a sederent of the cuttikilt mess, used to pull out this token, and kiss it, and howl about it, to the great amusement of the bottle-nosed old Major and the rest of the table. "My father and hers couldn't put their horses together," Jack said. "The General wouldn't come down with more than 6,000. My governor said it shouldn't be done under 8. Lovelace told him to go and be hanged, and so we parted company. They said she was in a decline. Gammon! She's 40, and as tough and as sour as this bitter lemon peel. Don't put much into your punch, Snob, my boy. No man can stand punch after wine." "And what are your pursuits, Jack?" says I. "Sold out when the governor died. Mother lives at Bath. Go down there once a year for a week. Dreadful slow. Shilling whist. 4 sisters, all unmarried except the youngest. Awful work. Scotland in August. Italy in the winter. Cursed rheumatism. Come to London in March and toddle about at the club, old boy. And we won't go home till morning, till daylight does appear." "And here's the wreck of 2 lives," mused the present snobographer, after taking leave of Jack Spiggot. "Pretty merry Letty Lovelace's rudder lost and she cast away, and handsome Jack Spiggot stranded on the shore like a drunken Trinculo. What was it that insulted nature, to use no higher name, and perverted her kindly intentions towards them? What cursed frost was it that nipped the love that both were bearing, and condemned the girl to sour sterility, and the lad to selfish old bachelorhood? It was the infernal snob tyrant who governs us all, who says, "Thou shalt not love without a lady's maid. Thou shalt not marry without a carriage and horses. Thou shalt have no wife in thy heart, and no children on thy knee, without a page in buttons and a French bonne. Thou shalt go to the devil unless thou hast a brougham. Marry poor, and society shall forsake thee. Thy kinsmen shall avoid thee as a criminal. Thy aunts and uncles shall turn up their eyes and bemoan the sad, sad manner in which Tom or Harry has thrown himself away. You, young woman, may sell yourself without shame and marry old Croesus. You, young man, may lie away your heart and your life for a jointure. But if you are poor, woe be to you. Society, the brutal snob autocrat, consigns you to solitary perdition. Wither, poor girl, in your garret. Rot, poor bachelor, in your club. When I see those graceless recluses, those unnatural monks and nuns of the order of Saint Beelzebub, my hatred for snobs and their worship and their idols passes all continence. Let us hew down that man-eating juggernaut, I say, that hideous Dagon. And I glow with the heroic courage of Tom Thumb, and join battle with the giant Snob. Footnote. This, of course, is understood to apply only to those unmarried persons whom a mean and snobbish fear about money has kept from fulfilling their natural destiny. Many persons there are devoted to celibacy because they cannot help it. Of these a man would be a brute who spoke roughly. Indeed, after Miss O'Toole's conduct to the writer, he would be the last to condemn. But never mind. These are personal matters. End of footnote. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 34. Snobs and Marriage. In that noble romance called 10,000 a Year, I remember a profoundly pathetic description of the Christian manner in which the hero, Mr. Aubrey, bore his misfortunes. After making a display of the most florid and grandiloquent resignation, and quitting his country mansion, the writer supposes Aubrey to come to town in a post-chaise and pair, sitting bodkin probably between his wife and sister. It is about 7 o'clock, carriages are rattling about, knockers are thundering, and tears bedim the fine eyes of Kate and Mrs. Aubrey, as they think that in happier times at this hour their Aubrey used formerly to go out to dinner to the houses of the aristocracy, his friends. This is the gist of the passage, the elegant words I forget. But the noble, noble sentiment I shall always cherish and remember. What can be more sublime than the notion of a great man's relatives in tears about his dinner? With a few touches, what author ever more happily described a snob? We were reading the passage lately at the house of my friend Raymond Gray, Esquire, barrister at law, an ingenuous youth without the least practice, but who has luckily a great share of good spirits, which enables him to bide his time, and bear laughingly his humble position in the world. Meanwhile, until it is altered, the stern laws of necessity and the expenses of the Northern Circuit oblige Mr. Gray to live in a very tiny mansion, in a very queer small square, in the airy neighbourhood of Gray's Inn Lane. What is the more remarkable is, that Gray has a wife there. Mrs. Gray was a Miss Harley Baker, and I suppose I need not say that is a respectable family. Allied to the Cavendishes, the Oxfords, the Marybones, they still, though rather déchus from their original splendour, hold their heads as high as any. Mrs. Harley Baker, I know, never goes to church without John behind to carry her prayer book. Nor will Miss Welbeck, her sister, walk 20 yards a-shopping without the protection of Figby, her sugar-loaf page, though the old lady is as ugly as any woman in the parish, and as tall and whiskery as a grenadier. The astonishment is, how Emily Harley Baker could have stooped to marry Raymond Gray. She, who was the prettiest and proudest of the family, she, who refused Sir Cockle Byles of the Bengal service, she, who turned up her little nose at Essex Temple, Q.C., and connected with the noble house of Albyn, she, who had but £4,000 pour tout potage, to marry a man who had scarcely as much more. A scream of wrath and indignation was uttered by the whole family when they heard of this mésalliance. Mrs. Harley Baker never speaks of her daughter now but with tears in her eyes, and as a ruined creature. Miss Welbeck says, "I consider that man a villain," and has denounced poor good-natured Mrs. Perkins as a swindler, at whose ball the young people met for the first time. Mr. and Mrs. Gray, meanwhile, live in Gray's Inn Lane aforesaid, with a maid-servant and a nurse, whose hands are very full, and in a most provoking and unnatural state of happiness. They have never once thought of crying about their dinner, like the wretchedly puling and snobbish womankind of my favourite snob Aubrey of 10,000 a Year, but on the contrary accept such humble victuals as fate awards them with a most perfect and thankful good grace, nay, actually have a portion for a hungry friend at times, as the present writer can gratefully testify. I was mentioning these dinners, and some admirable lemon puddings which Mrs. Gray makes, to our mutual friend the great Mr. Goldmore, the East India Director, when that gentleman's face assumed an expression of almost apoplectic terror, and he gasped out, "What! Do they give dinners?" He seemed to think it a crime and a wonder that such people should dine at all, and that it was their custom to huddle round their kitchen fire over a bone and a crust. Whenever he meets them in society, it is a matter of wonder to him, and he always expresses his surprise very loud, how the lady can appear decently dressed, and the man have an unpatched coat to his back. I have heard him enlarge upon this poverty before the whole room at the Conflagrative Club, to which he and I and Gray have the honour to belong. We meet at the club on most days. At 4:30 Goldmore arrives in St. James's Street from the City, and you may see him reading the evening papers in the bow window of the club, which enfilades Pall Mall, a large plethoric man with a bunch of seals in a large bow-windowed light waistcoat. He has large coat-tails stuffed with agents' letters and papers about companies of which he is a director. His seals jingle as he walks. I wish I had such a man for an uncle, and that he himself were childless. I would love and cherish him, and be kind to him. At 6 o'clock in the full season, when all the world is in St. James's Street, and the carriages are cutting in and out among the cabs on the stand, and the tufted dandies are showing their listless faces out of whites, and you see respectable grey-headed gentlemen waggling their heads to each other through the plate-glass windows of Arthur's, and the redcoats wish to be Briarian so as to hold all the gentlemen's horses, and that wonderful red-coated royal porter is sunning himself before Marlborough House, at the noon of London time you see a light yellow carriage with black horses, and a coachman in a tight floss-silk wig, and 2 footmen in powder and white and yellow liveries, and a large woman inside in shot silk, a poodle, and a pink parasol, which drives up to the gate of the Conflagrative, and the page goes and says to Mr. Goldmore, who is perfectly aware of the fact, as he is looking out of the windows with about 40 other Conflagrative bucks, "Your carriage, sir." G. wags his head. "Remember, 8 o'clock precisely," says he to Mulligatawny, the other East India Director, and, ascending the carriage, plumps down by the side of Mrs. Goldmore for a drive in the park, and then home to Portland Place. As the carriage whirls off, all the young bucks in the club feel a secret elation. It is a part of their establishment, as it were. That carriage belongs to their club, and their club belongs to them. They follow the equipage with interest. They eye it knowingly as they see it in the park. But halt! We are not come to the club snobs yet. Oh, my brave snobs, what a flurry there will be among you when those papers appear! Well, you may judge from the above description what sort of a man Goldmore is. A dull and pompous Leadenhall Street Croesus, good-natured withal and affable, cruelly affable. "Mr. Goldmore can never forget," his lady used to say, "that it was Mrs. Gray's grandfather who sent him to India; and though that young woman has made the most imprudent marriage in the world, and has left her station in society, her husband seems an ingenious and laborious young man, and we shall do everything in our power to be of use to him." So they used to ask the Grays to dinner twice or thrice in a season, when, by way of increasing the kindness, Buff the butler is ordered to hire a fly to convey them to and from Portland Place. Of course I am much too good-natured a friend of both parties not to tell Gray of Goldmore's opinion in him, and the nabob's astonishment at the idea of the briefless barrister having any dinner at all. Indeed, Goldmore's saying became a joke against Gray amongst us wags at the club, and we used to ask him when he tasted meat last, whether we should bring him home something from dinner, and cut 1,000 other mad pranks with him in our facetious way. One day, then, coming home from the club, Mr. Gray conveyed to his wife the astounding information that he had asked Goldmore to dinner. "My love," says Mrs. Gray in a tremor, "how could you be so cruel? Why, the dining-room won't hold Mrs. Goldmore." "Make your mind easy, Mrs. Gray. Her ladyship is in Paris. It is only Croesus that's coming, and we are going to the play afterwards, to Sadler's Wells. Goldmore said at the club that he thought Shakespeare was a great dramatic poet and ought to be patronised, whereupon, fired with enthusiasm, I invited him to our banquet."
"Goodness gracious! What can we give him for dinner? He has 2 French cooks. You know Mrs. Goldmore is always telling us about them, and he dines with aldermen every day."
"A plain leg of mutton, my Lucy, I prithee get ready at 3. Have it tender and smoking and juicy, and what better meat can there be?" says Gray, quoting my favourite poet.
"But the cook is ill, and you know that horrible Patipan the pastry cook's—"
"Silence, Frau," says Gray, in a deep tragedy voice. "I will have the ordering of this repast. Do all things as I bid thee. Invite our friend Snob here to partake of the feast. Be mine the task of procuring it."
"Don't be expensive, Raymond," says his wife.
"Peace, thou timid partner of the briefless one. Goldmore's dinner shall be suited to our narrow means. Only do thou in all things my commands." And seeing by the peculiar expression of the rogue's countenance that some mad waggery was in preparation, I awaited the morrow with anxiety. End of Chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 35. Punctual to the hour. By the way, I cannot omit to mark down my hatred, scorn, and indignation towards those miserable snobs who come to dinner at 9 when they are asked at 8, in order to make a sensation in the company. Be the loathing of honest folks, the backbiting of others, the curses of cooks, pursue these wretches, and avenge the society on which they trample. Punctual, I say, to the hour of 5, which Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Gray had appointed, a youth of an elegant appearance, in a neat evening dress, whose trim whiskers indicated neatness, whose light step denoted activity, for in sooth he was hungry, and always is at the dinner hour, whatsoever the hour may be, and whose rich golden hair, curling down his shoulders, was set off by a perfectly new 4 9/10 silk hat, was seen wending his way down Bittlestone Street, Bittlestone Square, Gray's Inn. The person in question, I need not say, was Mr. Snob. He was never late when invited to dine. But to proceed my narrative, Mr. Snob may have flattered himself that he made a sensation as he started down Bittlestone with his richly gilt, knobbed cane, and indeed I vow I saw heads looking at me from Mrs. Squilby's, the brass-plated milliner, opposite Raymond Gray's, who has 3 silver paper bonnets, and 2 fly-blown prints of fashion in the window. Yet what was the emotion produced by my arrival compared to that which the little street thrilled, when at 5 minutes past 5, the floss-wigged coachman, the yellow hammer-cloth and flunkeys, the black horses and blazing silver harness of Mr. Goldmore whirled down the street? It is a very little street, of very little houses, most of them with very large brass plates like Miss Squilby's. Coal merchants, architects and surveyors, 2 surgeons, a solicitor, a dancing master, and, of course, several house agents occupy the houses, little 2-storied edifices with little stucco porticos. Goldmore's carriage overtopped the roofs almost. The first floors might shake hands with Croesus as he lolled inside. All the windows of those first floors thronged with children and women in a twinkling. There was Mrs. Hammerly in curl-papers, Mrs. Saxby with her front awry, Mr. Wriggles peering through the gauze curtains, holding the while his hot glass of rum and water. In fine, a tremendous commotion in Bittlestone Street, as the Goldmore carriage drove up to Mr. Raymond Gray's door. "How kind it is of him to come with both the footmen," said little Mrs. Gray, peeping at the vehicle too. The huge domestic, descending from his perch, gave a rap at the door which almost drove in the building. All the heads were out. The sun was shining. The very organ boy paused. The footman, the coach, and Goldmore's red face and white waistcoat were blazing in splendour. The Herculean plushed one went back to open the carriage door. Raymond Gray opened his, in his shirt sleeves. He ran up to the carriage. "Come in, Goldmore," says he. "Just in time, my boy. Open the door, what d'ye call 'em, and let your master out." And what d'ye call 'em obeyed mechanically, with a face of wonder and horror only to be equalled by the look of stupefied astonishment which ornamented the purple countenance of his master. "What time will you please have the cage, sir?" says what d'ye call 'em in that peculiar, unspellable, inimitable, flunkified pronunciation which forms one of the chief charms of existence. "Best have it to the theatre at night," Gray exclaims. "It is but a step from here to the Wells, and we can walk there. I've got tickets for all. Be at Sadler's Wells at 11. "Yes, at 11, exclaims Goldmore perturbedly, and walks with a flurried step into the house, as if he were going to execution, as indeed he was, with that wicked Gray as a Jack Ketch over him. The carriage drove away, followed by numberless eyes from doorsteps and balconies. Its appearance is still a wonder in Biddlestone Street. "Go in there and amuse yourself with Snob," says Gray, opening the little drawing-room door. "I'll call out as soon as the chops are ready. Fanny's below, seeing to the pudding." "Gracious mercy," said Goldmore to me, quite confidentially, "how could he ask us? I really had no idea of this utter destitution." "Dinner! Dinner!" roars out Gray from the dining-room, whence issued a great smoking and frying, and entering that apartment we find Mrs. Gray ready to receive us, and looking perfectly like a princess who, by some accident, had a bowl of potatoes in her hand, which vegetables she placed on the table. Her husband was meanwhile cooking mutton chops on a gridiron over the fire. "Fanny has made the roly-poly pudding," says he. "The chops are my part. Here's a fine one. Try this, Goldmore." And he popped a fizzling cutlet on that gentleman's plate. What words, what notes of exclamation, can describe the nabob's astonishment? The tablecloth was a very old one, darned in a score places. There was mustard in a teacup, a silver fork for Goldmore. All ours were iron. "I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth," says Gray, gravely. "That fork is the only one we have. Fanny has it generally." "Raymond!" cries Mrs. Gray, with an imploring face. "She was used to better things, you know, and I hope one day to get her a dinner service. I'm told the electro plate is uncommonly good. Where the deuce is that boy with the beer? And now," said he, springing up, "I'll be a gentleman." And so he put on his coat, and sat down quite gravely, with 4 fresh mutton chops, which he had by this time broiled. "We don't have meat every day, Mr. Goldmore," he continued, "and it's a treat to me to get a dinner like this. You little know, you gentlemen of England, who live at home at ease, what hardships briefless barristers endure." "Gracious mercy!" said Mr. Goldmore. "Where's the half and half? Fanny, go over to the Keys and get the beer. Here's 6d." And what was our astonishment when Fanny got up as if to go. "Gracious mercy, let me!" cries Goldmore. "Not for worlds, my dear sir. She's used to it. They wouldn't serve you as well as they serve her. Leave her alone. Law bless you," Raymond said, with astounding composure. And Mrs. Gray left the room, and actually came back with a tray on which there was a pewter flagon of beer. Little Polly, to whom at her christening I had the honour of presenting a silver mug ex officio, followed with a couple of tobacco pipes, and the queerest roguish look in her round little chubby face. "Did you speak to Tapling about the gin, Fanny, my dear?" Gray asked, after bidding Polly put the pipes on the chimney-piece, which that little person had some difficulty in reaching. "The last was turpentine, and even your brewing didn't make good punch of it. You would hardly suspect, Goldmore, that my wife, a Harley baker, would ever make gin punch? I think my mother-in-law would commit suicide if she saw her." "Don't always be laughing at mamma, Raymond," said Mrs. Gray. "Well, well, she wouldn't die, and I don't wish she would."
And you don't make gin punch, and you don't like it either. And, Goldmore, do you drink your beer out of the glass or out of the pewter?" "Gracious mercy!" ejaculates Croesus once more, as little Polly, taking the pot with both her little bunches of hands, offers it, smiling, to that astonished director. And so, in a word, the dinner commenced, and was presently ended in a similar fashion. Gray pursued his unfortunate guest with the most queer and outrageous description of his struggles, misery, and poverty. He described how he cleaned the knives when they were first married, and how he used to drag the children in a little cart, how his wife would toss pancakes, and what parts of his dress she made. He told Tibbets, his clerk, who was in fact the functionary who had brought the beer from the public-house, which Mrs. Fanny had fetched from the neighbouring apartment, to fetch the bottle of port wine when the dinner was over, and told Goldmore as wonderful a history about the way in which that bottle of wine had come into his hands as any of his former stories had been. When the repast was all over, and it was near time to move to the play, and Mrs. Gray had retired, and we were sitting ruminating rather silently over the last glasses of the port, Gray suddenly breaks the silence by slapping Goldmore on the shoulder and saying, "Now, Goldmore, tell me something." "What?" asks Croesus. "Haven't you had a good dinner?" Goldmore started, as if a sudden truth had just dawned upon him. He had had a good dinner, and didn't know it until then. The 3 mutton chops consumed by him were best of the mutton kind. The potatoes were perfect of their order. As for the roly-poly, it was too good. The porter was frothy and cool, and the port wine was worthy of the gills of a bishop. I speak with ulterior views, for there is more in Gray's cellar. "Well," says Goldmore, after a pause, during which he took time to consider the momentous question Gray put to him, "'Pon my word, now you say so, I really have had a monstrous good dinner. Monstrous good, upon my word. Here's your health, Gray, my boy, and your amiable lady, and when Mrs. Goldmore comes back, I hope we shall see you more in Portland Place." And with this the time came for the play, and we went to see Mr. Phelps at Sadler's Wells. The best of this story, for the truth of every word of which I pledge my honour, is, that after this banquet, which Goldmore enjoyed so, the honest fellow felt a prodigious compassion and regard for the starving and miserable giver of the feast, and determined to help him in his profession. And being a director of the newly established Anti-Bilious Life Assurance Company, he has had Gray appointed standing counsel, with a pretty annual fee, and only yesterday, in an appeal from Bombay, Buckmajee Bamajee versus Ramchatter Bahadur, in the Privy Council, Lord Brougham complimented Mr. Gray, who was in the case, on his curious and exact knowledge of the Sanskrit language. Whether he knows Sanskrit or not, I can't say, but Goldmore got him the business, and so I cannot help having a lurking regard for that pompous old bigwig. End of chapter 35. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire. Chapter 36 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 36. Snobs and Marriage. We bachelors in clubs are very much obliged to you, says my old school and college companion, Essex Temple, for the opinion which you hold of us. You call us selfish, purple-faced, bloated, and other pretty names. You state, in the simplest possible terms, that we shall go to the deuce. You bid us rot in loneliness, and deny us all claims to honesty, conduct, decent Christian life. Who are you, Mr. Snob, to judge us? Who are you, with your infernal benevolent smirk and grin, that laugh at all our generation? I will tell you my case, says Essex Temple, mine and my sister Polly's, and you make what you like of it, and sneer at old maids, and bully old bachelors, if you will. I will whisper to you confidentially that my sister was engaged to Sergeant Shirker, a fellow whose talents one cannot deny, and be hanged to them, but whom I have always known to be mean, selfish, and a prig. However, women don't see these faults in the men whom love throws in their way. Shirker, who has about as much warmth as an eel, made up to Polly years and years ago, and was no bad match for a briefless barrister, as he was then. Have you ever read Lord Eldon's life? Do you remember how the sordid old snob narrates his going out to purchase 2 pence worth of sprats, which he and Mrs. Scott fried between them? And how he parades his humility, and exhibits his miserable poverty, he who, at that time, must have been making £1,000 a year? Well, Shirker was just as proud of his prudence, just as thankful for his own meanness, and of course would not marry without a competency. Who so honourable? Polly waited, and waited faintly, from year to year. He wasn't sick at heart. His passion never disturbed his 6 hours' sleep, or kept his ambition out of mind. He would rather have hugged an attorney any day than have kissed Polly, though she was one of the prettiest creatures in the world. And while she was pining alone upstairs, reading over the stock of half a dozen frigid letters that the confounded prig had consented to write to her, he, be sure, was never busy with anything but his briefs in chambers, always frigid, rigid, self-satisfied, and at his duty. The marriage trailed on year after year, while Mr. Serjeant Shirker grew to be the famous lawyer he is. Meanwhile, my younger brother, Pump Temple, who was in the 120th Hussars, and had the same little patrimony which fell to the lot of myself and Polly, must fall in love with our cousin, Fanny Figtree, and marry her out of hand. You should have seen the wedding. 6 bridesmaids in pink, to hold the fan, bouquet, gloves, scent bottle, and pocket handkerchief of the bride. Basketfuls of white favours in the vestry, to be pinned on the footmen and horses. A genteel congregation of curious acquaintance in the pews, a shabby one of poor on the steps, all the carriages of our acquaintance, whom Aunt Figtree had levied for the occasion, and, of course, 4 horses for Mr. Pump's bridal vehicle. Then comes the breakfast, or déjeuner, if you please, with a brass band in the street, and policemen to keep order. The happy bridegroom spends about a year's income in dresses for the bridesmaids and pretty presents, and the bride must have a trousseau of laces, satins, jewel boxes, and tomfoolery, to make her fit to be a lieutenant's wife. There was no hesitation about Pump. He flung about his money as if he had been dross, and Mrs. P. Temple, on the horse Tom Tiddler, which her husband gave her, was the most dashing of military women at Brighton or Dublin. How old Mrs. Figtree used to bore me and Polly with stories of Pump's grandeur and the noble company he kept. Polly lives with the Figtrees, as I am not rich enough to keep a home for her. Pump and I have always been rather distant. Not having the slightest notions about horseflesh, he has a natural contempt for me, and in our mother's lifetime, when the good old lady was always paying his debts and petting him, I'm not sure there was not a little jealousy. It used to be Polly that kept the peace between us. She went to Dublin to visit Pump, and brought back grand accounts of his doings, gayest man about town, aide de camp to the Lord Lieutenant. Fanny admired everywhere. Her Excellency godmother to the second boy, the eldest with a string of aristocratic Christian names that made the grandmother wild with delight. Presently Fanny and Pump obligingly came to London, where the third was born. Polly was godmother to this, and who so loving as she and Pump now? "Oh, Essex," says she to me, "he is so good, so generous, so fond of his family, so handsome. Who can help loving him, and pardoning his little errors?" One day, while Mrs. Pump was yet in the upper regions, and Dr. Fingerfree's brougham at her door every day, having business at Guildhall, whom should I meet in Cheapside but Pump and Polly? The poor girl looked more happy and rosy than I have seen her these 12 years. Pump, on the contrary, was rather blushing and embarrassed. I couldn't be mistaken in her face and its look of mischief and triumph. She had been committing some act of sacrifice. I went to the family stockbroker. She had sold out £2,000 that morning and given them to Pump. Quarrelling was useless. Pump had the money. He was off to Dublin by the time I reached his mother's, and Polly radiant still. He was going to make his fortune. He was going to embark the money in the bog of Allen. I don't know what. The fact is, he was going over to pay his losses upon the last Manchester steeplechase, and I leave you to imagine how much principal or interest poor Polly ever saw back again. It was more than half her fortune, and he has had another 1,000 since from her. Then came efforts to stave off ruin and prevent exposure, struggles on all our parts, and sacrifices that"—here Mr. Essex Temple began to hesitate—"that needn't be talked of, but they are of no more use than such sacrifices ever are. Pump and his wife are abroad. I don't like to ask where. Polly has the 3 children, and Mr. Serjeant Shirker has formally written to break off an engagement, on the conclusion of which Miss Temple must herself have speculated, when she alienated the greater part of her fortune. And here's your famous theory of poor marriages," Essex Temple cries, concluding the above history. "How do you know that I don't want to marry myself? How do you dare sneer at my poor sister? What are we but martyrs of the reckless marriage system, which Mr. Snob, forsooth, chooses to advocate? And he thought he had the better of the argument, which, strange to say, is not my opinion. But for the infernal snob worship, might not every one of these people be happy? If poor Polly's happiness lay in linking her tender arms around such a heartless prig as the sneak who has deceived her, she might have been happy now, as happy as Raymond in the ballad, with the stone statue by his side. She is wretched, because Mr. Serjeant Shirker worships money and ambition, and is a snob and a coward. If the unfortunate Pump Temple and his giddy hussy of a wife have ruined themselves, and dragged down others into their calamity, it is because they loved rank, and horses, and plate, and carriages, and court guides, and millinery, and would sacrifice all to attain those objects. And who misguides them? If the world were more simple, would not these foolish people follow the fashion? Does not the world love court guides, and millinery, and plate, and carriages? Mercy on us! Read the fashionable intelligence, read the court circular, read the genteel novels, survey mankind, from Pimlico to Red Lion Square, and see how the poor snob is aping the rich snob, how the mean snob is grovelling at the feet of the proud snob, and the great snob is lording it over his humble brother. Does the idea of equality ever enter Dives' head? Will it ever? Will the Duchess of Fitzbattleaxe (I like a good name) ever believe that Lady Croesus, her next door neighbour in Belgrave Square, is as good a lady as her Grace? Will Lady Croesus ever leave off pining the Duchess's parties, and cease patronizing Mrs. Broadcloth, whose husband has not got his baronetcy yet? Will Mrs. Broadcloth ever heartily shake hands with Mrs. Seedy, and give up those odious calculations about poor dear Mrs. Seedy's income? Will Mrs. Seedy, who is starving in her great house, go and live comfortably in a little one, or in lodgings? Will her landlady, Miss Letsome, ever stop wondering at the familiarity of tradespeople, or rebuking the insolence of Sukey, the maid, who wears flowers under her bonnet like a lady? But why hope? Why wish for such times? Do I wish all snobs to perish? Do I wish these snobs' papers to determine? Suicidal fool, art not thou, too, a snob and a brother? End of chapter 36. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire.
Chapter 37 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dennis Sayers. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 37. Club Snobs. As I wish to be particularly agreeable to the ladies, to whom I make my most humble obeisance, we will now, if you please, commence maligning a class of snobs, against whom, I believe, most female minds are embittered. I mean club snobs. I have seldom heard even the most gentle and placable woman speak without a little feeling of bitterness against those social institutions, those palaces swaggering in St. James, which are open to the men, while the ladies have but their dingy three-windowed brick boxes in Belgravia, or in Paddingtonia, or in the region between the road of Edgware and that of Gray's Inn. In my grandfather's time it used to be Freemasonry that roused their anger. It was my great aunt, whose portrait we still have in the family, who got into the clock case at the Royal Rosicrucian Lodge at Bungay, Suffolk, to spy the proceedings of the society of which her husband was a member, and being frightened by the sudden whirring and striking 11 of the clock, just as the deputy grand master was bringing in the mystic gridiron for the reception of a neophyte, rushed out into the midst of the lodge assembled, and was elected by a desperate unanimity deputy grand mistress for life, though that admirable and courageous female never subsequently breathed a word with regard to the secrets of the initiation, yet she inspired all our family with such a terror regarding the mysteries of Jachin and Boaz that none of our family have ever since joined the society or worn the dreadful Masonic insignia. It is known that Orpheus was torn to pieces by some justly indignant Thracian ladies for belonging to an harmonic lodge. Let him go back to Eurydice, they said, whom he is pretending to regret so. But the history is given in Dr. Lempriere's elegant dictionary in a manner much more forcible than any this feeble pen can attempt. At once, then, and without verbiage, let us take up this subject matter of clubs. Clubs ought not, in my mind, to be permitted to bachelors. If my friend of the cuddy kilts had not our club, the Union Jack, to go to, I belong to the U.J. and 9 other similar institutions, who knows but he never would be a bachelor at this present moment? Instead of being made comfortable and cockered up with every luxury, as they are at clubs, bachelors ought to be rendered profoundly miserable, in my opinion. Every encouragement should be given to the rendering their spare time disagreeable. There can be no more odious object, according to my sentiments, than young Smith in the pride of health, commanding his dinner of 3 courses; than middle-aged Jones, wallowing, as I may say, in an easy padded armchair over the delicious novel or brilliant magazine; or than old Brown, that selfish old reprobate, for whom mere literature has no charms, stretched on the best sofa, sitting on the second edition of the Times, having the Morning Chronicle between his knees, the Herald pushed in between his coat and waistcoat, the Standard under his arm, the Globe under the other pinion, and the Daily News in perusal. "I'll trouble you for Punch, Mr. Wiggins," says the unconscionable old gormandizer, interrupting our friend, who is laughing over the periodical in question. This kind of selfishness ought not to be. No, no. Young Smith, instead of his dinner and his wine, ought to be where? At the festive tea-table, to be sure, by the side of Miss Higgs, sipping the bohea or tasting the harmless muffin, while old Mrs. Higgs looks on, pleased at their innocent dalliance, and my friend Miss Wirt, the governess, is performing Thalberg's last sonata in treble X, totally unheeded, at the piano. Where should the middle-aged Jones be? At his time of life He ought to be the father of a family. At such an hour, say at 9 o'clock at night, the nursery bell should have just rung the children to bed. He and Mrs. J. ought to be, by rights, seated on each side of the fire by the dining room table, a bottle of port wine between them, not so full as it was an hour since. Mrs. J. has had 2 glasses. Mrs. Grumble, Jones's mother-in-law, has had 3. Jones himself has finished the rest, and dozes comfortably until bedtime. And Brown, that old newspaper devouring miscreant, what right has he at a club at a decent hour of night? He ought to be playing his rubber with Miss Meckwhirter, his wife, and the family apothecary. His candle ought to be brought to him at 10 o'clock, and he should retire to rest just as the young people were thinking of a dance. How much finer, simpler, nobler are the several employments I have sketched out for these gentlemen than their present nightly orgies at this horrid club. And, ladies, think of men who do not merely frequent the dining room and library, but who use other apartments of those horrible dens which it is my purpose to batter down. Think of Cannon, the wretch, with his coat off, at his age and size, clattering the balls over the billiard table all night, and making bets with that odious Captain Spot. Think of Pam in a dark room with Bob Trumper, Jack Deuceace, and Charlie Vole, playing, the poor dear misguided wretch, guinea points and £5 on the rubber. Above all, think of that den of abomination which I am told has been established in some clubs, called the smoking room. Think of the debauchees who congregate there, the quantities of reeking whiskey punch, or more dangerous, sherry cobbler, which they consume. Think of them coming home at cock crow and letting themselves into the quiet house with the Chubb key. Think of them, the hypocrites, taking off their insidious boots before they slink upstairs, the children sleeping overhead, the wife of their bosom alone with the waning rushlight in the 2-pair front, the chamber so soon to be rendered hateful by the smell of their stale cigars. I am not an advocate of violence. I am not by nature of an incendiary turn of mind. But if, my dear ladies, you are for assassinating Mr. Chubb and burning down club houses in St. James, there is one snob who will not think the worse of you. The only men who, as I opine, ought to be allowed the use of clubs are married men without a profession. The continual presence of these in a house cannot be thought, even by the most loving of wives, desirable. Say the girls are beginning to practice their music, which in an honourable English family ought to occupy every young gentlewoman 3 hours. It would be rather hard to call upon poor papa to sit in the drawing-room all that time, and listen to the interminable discords and shrieks which are elicited from the miserable piano during the above necessary operation. A man with a good ear, especially, would go mad if compelled daily to submit to this horror. Or suppose you have a fancy to go to the milliner's, or to Howell and James. It is manifest, my dear madam, that your husband is much better at the club during these operations than by your side in the carriage, or perched in wonder upon one of the stools at Shawl and Gimcrack's, whilst young counter-dandies are displaying their wares. This sort of husbands should be sent out after breakfast, and, if not members of Parliament, or directors of a railroad or an insurance company, should be put into their clubs, and told to remain there until dinner time. No sight is more agreeable to my truly regulated mind than to see the noble characters so worthily employed. Whenever I pass by St. James Street, having the privilege, like the rest of the world, of looking in at the windows of Blight's or Foodle's or Snook's, or the Great Bay at the Contemplative Club, I behold with respectful appreciation the figures within, the honest rosy old fogies, the mouldy old dandies, the waist belts and glossy wigs and tight cravats of those most vacuous and respectable men. Such men are best there during the daytime, surely. When you part with them, dear ladies, think of the rapture consequent on their return. You have transacted your household affairs, you have made your purchases, you have paid your visits, you have aired your poodle in the park, your French maid has completed the toilette which renders you so ravishingly beautiful by candlelight, and you are fit to make home pleasant to him who has been absent all day. Such men surely ought to have their clubs, and we will not class them among club snobs, therefore, on whom let us reserve our attack for the next chapter. End of chapter 37, read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox.
Chapter 38 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Shapiro. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 38. Club Snobs. Such a sensation has been created in the clubs by the appearance of the last paper on Club Snobs as can't but be complimentary to me who am one of their number. I belong to many clubs. The Union Jack, the Sash and Marlinspike, military clubs. The True Blue, the No Surrender, the Blue and Buff, the Guy Fawkes, and the Cato Street, political clubs. The Brummel and the Regent, dandy clubs. The Acropolis, the Palladium, the Areopagus, the Nix, the Pentelicus, the Ilyssus, and the Polyploisbeothalasus, literary clubs. I never could make out how the latter set of clubs got their names. I don't know Greek, for one, and I wonder how many other members of those institutions do. Ever since the Club Snobs have been announced, I observe a sensation created on my entrance into any one of these places. Members get up and hustle together. They nod, they scowl, as they glance towards the present snob. "Infernal impudent jackanapes! If he shows me up," says Colonel Bludyer, "I'll break every bone in his skin." "I told you what would come of admitting literary men into the club," says Ranville Ramville to his colleague Spooney, of the tape and sealing-wax office. These people are very well in their proper places, and as a public man I make a point of shaking hands with them, and that sort of thing, but to have one's privacy obtruded upon by such people is really too much. Come along, Spooney, and the pair of prigs retire superciliously. As I came into the coffee-room at the No Surrender, old Jawkins was holding out to a knot of men, who were yawning as usual. There he stood, waving the standard, and swaggering before the fire. "What," says he, "did I tell Peel last year? If you touch the Corn Laws, you touch the sugar question. If you touch the sugar, you touch the tea. I am no monopolist. I am a liberal man, but I cannot forget that I stand on the brink of a precipice, and if we're to have free trade, give me reciprocity. And what was Sir Robert Peel's answer to me? Mr. Jawkins, he said. Here Jawkins' eye suddenly turning on your humble servant, he stopped his sentence with a guilty look, his stale old stupid sentence which every one of us at the club has heard over and over again. Jawkins is a most pertinacious club snob. Every day he is at that fireplace, holding that standard, of which he reads up the leading article and pours it out oro rotundo with the most astonishing composure in the face of his neighbor, who has just read every word of it in the paper. Jawkins has money, as you may see by the tie of his neckcloth. He passes the morning swaggering about the city, in bankers' and brokers' parlours, and says, I spoke with Peel yesterday, and his intentions are so and so. Graham and I were talking over the matter, and I pledge you my word of honour his opinion coincides with mine, and that what-do-you-call-him is the only measure government will venture on trying. By evening paper time he is at the club. I can tell you the opinion of the city, my lord, says he, and the way in which Jones Lloyd looks as it is briefly this. Rothschilds told me so themselves. In Mark Lane people's minds are quite made up. He is considered rather a well-informed man. He lives in Belgravia, of course, in a drab-coloured genteel house, and has everything about him that is properly grave, dismal, and comfortable. His dinners are in the Morning Herald, among the parties for the week, and his wife and daughters make a very handsome appearance at the drawing-room once a year, when he comes down to the club in his deputy lieutenant's uniform. He is fond of beginning a speech to you by saying, "When I was in the House, I," etc. In fact, he sat for Skittlebury for 3 weeks in the first Reform Parliament, and was unseated for bribery, since which he has 3 times unsuccessfully contested that honourable borough. Another sort of political snob I have seen at most clubs, and that is the man who does not care so much for home politics, but is great upon foreign affairs. I think this sort of man is scarcely found anywhere but in clubs. It is for him the papers provide their foreign articles, at the expense of some 10,000 a year each. He is the man who is really seriously uncomfortable about the designs of Russia, and the atrocious treachery of Louis Philippe. He it is who expects a French fleet in the Thames, and has a constant eye upon the American President, every word of whose speech, goodness help him, he reads. He knows the names of the contending leaders in Portugal, and what they are fighting about, and it is he who says that Lord Aberdeen ought to be impeached, and Lord Palmerston hanged, or vice versa. Lord Palmerston's being sold to Russia, the exact number of roubles paid, by what house in the city, is a favourite theme with this kind of snob. I once overheard him, it was Captain Spitfire, Royal Navy, who had been refused a ship by the Whigs, by the way, indulging in the following conversation with Mr. Minns after dinner. Why wasn't the Princess Scragamoffsky at Lady Palmerston's party, Minns? Because she can't show. Why can't she show? Shall I tell you, Minns, why she can't show? The Princess Scragamoffsky's back is flayed alive, Minns. I tell you it's raw, sir. On Tuesday last at 12 o'clock 3 drummers of the Preobrajenski regiment arrived at Ashburnham House, and at 12:30 in the yellow drawing-room at the Russian embassy, before the ambassadress and 4 ladies' maids, the Greek papa, and the secretary of embassy, Madame de Scragamoffsky, received 13 dozen. She was knouted, sir, knouted in the midst of England, in Berkeley Square, for having said that the Grand Duchess Olga's hair was red. And now, sir, will you tell me Lord Palmerston ought to continue minister? Minns: Good God! Minns follows Spitfire about, and thinks him the greatest and wisest of human beings. End of chapter 38. Recording by Caroline Shapiro, Oakland, California, USA. Chapter 39 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Shapiro. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 39. Club Snobs. Why does not some great author write The Mysteries of the Clubhouses, or St. James's Street Unveiled? It would be a fine subject for an imaginative writer. We must all, as boys, remember when we went to the fair, and had spent all our money, the sort of awe and anxiety with which we loitered round the outside of the show, speculating upon the nature of the entertainment going on within. Man is a drama, of wonder and passion, and mystery and meanness, and beauty and truthfulness, and etc. Each bosom is a booth in Vanity Fair. But let us stop this capital style. I should die if I kept it up for a column. A pretty thing to column all capitals would be, by the way. In a club, though there mayn't be a soul of your acquaintance in the room, you have always the chance of watching strangers, and speculating on what is going on within those tents and curtains of their souls, their coats and waistcoats. This is a never-failing sport. Indeed, I am told there are some clubs in the town where nobody ever speaks to anybody. They sit in the coffee-room, quite silent, and watching each other. Yet how little you can tell from a man's outward demeanor! There's a man at our club, large, heavy, middle-aged, gorgeously dressed, rather bald, with lacquered boots and a boa when he goes out. Quiet in demeanor, always ordering and consuming a recherché little dinner, whom I have mistaken for Sir John Pocklington any time these 5 years, and respected as a man with £500 per diem. And I find he is but a clerk in an office in the city, with not £200 income, and his name is Jubber. Sir John Pocklington was, on the contrary, the dirty little snuffy man who cried out so about the bad quality of the beer, and grumbled at being overcharged 3 halfpence for a herring, seated at the next table to Jubber on the day when someone pointed the baronet out to me. Take a different sort of mystery. I see, for instance, old Fawney stealing round the rooms of the club, with glassy, meaningless eyes, and an endless greasy simper. He fawns on everybody he meets, and shakes hands with you, and blesses you, and betrays the most tender and astonishing interest in your welfare. You know him to be a quack and a rogue, and he knows you know it. But he wriggles on his way, and leaves a track of slimy flattery after him wherever he goes. Who can penetrate that man's mystery? What earthly good can he get from you or me? You don't know what is working under that leering, tranquil mask. You have only the dim, instinctive repulsion that warns you you are in the presence of a knave. Beyond which fact, all Fawney's soul is a secret to you. I think I like to speculate on the young men best. Their play is opener. You know the cards in their hand, as it were. Take, for example, Messrs. Spavin and Cockspur. A specimen or two of the above sort of young fellows may be found, I believe, at most clubs. They know nobody. They bring a fine smell of cigars into the room with them, and they growl together in a corner about sporting matters. They recollect the history of that short period in which they have been ornaments of the world, by the names of winning horses. As political men talk about the Reform year, the year the Whigs went out, and so forth, these young sporting bucks speak of Tarnation's year, or Apodeldock's year, or the year when Catawampus ran second for the Chester Cup. They play at billiards in the morning. They absorb pale ale for breakfast, and top up with glasses of strong waters. They read Bell's Life, and a very pleasant paper too, with a great deal of erudition in the answers to correspondence. They go down to Tattersall's and swagger in the park, with their hands plunged in the pockets of their paletots. What strikes me especially in the outward demeanor of sporting youth is their amazing gravity, their conciseness of speech, and careworn and moody air. In the smoking-room at the Regent, when Joe Millerson will be setting the whole room in a roar with laughter, you hear young Messrs. Spavin and Cockspur grumbling together in a corner. "I'll take your 25 to 1 about brother to Bluenose," whispers Spavin. "Can't do it at the price," Cockspur says, wagging his head ominously. The betting book is always present in the minds of those unfortunate youngsters. I think I hate that work even more than the peerage. There is some good in the latter, though, generally speaking, a vain record. Though De Mogyns is not descended from the giant Hogenmogen, though half the other genealogies are equally false and foolish, yet the mottos are good reading, some of them, and the book itself a sort of gold-laced, enlivened lackey to history, and in so far serviceable. But what good ever came out of or went into a betting book? If I could be Caliph Omar for a week, I would pitch every one of those despicable manuscripts into the flames. From my lord's, who is in with Jack Snaffle's stable, and his overreaching, worse-informed rogues and swindling greenhorns, down to Sam's, the butcher boy's, who books 18-penny odds in the tap-room, and stands to win 25 bob. In a turf transaction, either Spavin or Cockspur would try to get the better of his father, and, to gain a point in the odds, victimize his best friends. One day we shall hear of one or other levanting, an event at which, not being sporting men, we shall not break our hearts. See, Mr. Spavin is settling his toilette previous to departure, giving a curl in the glass to his side wisps of hair. Look at him. It is only at the hulks or among turfmen that you ever see a face so mean, so knowing, and so gloomy. A much more humane being among the youthful clubbists is the lady-killing snob. I saw Wiggle just now in the dressing-room talking to Waggle, his inseparable. Waggle. "'Pon my honour, Wiggle, she did. Wiggle. Well, Waggle, as you say, I own to think she did look at me rather kindly. We'll see to-night at the French play. And having arrayed their little persons, these two harmless young bucks go upstairs to dinner. End of chapter 39. Recording by Caroline Shapiro, Oakland, California, USA.
Chapter 40 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 40. Club Snobs. Both sorts of young men mentioned in my last under the flippant names of Wiggle and Waggle may be found in tolerable plenty, I think, in clubs. Wiggle and Waggle are both idle. They come of the middle classes. One of them very likely makes believe to be a barrister, and the other has smart apartments about Piccadilly. They are a sort of second-chop dandies. They cannot imitate that superb listlessness of demeanour and that admirable vacuous folly which distinguish the noble and high-born chiefs of the race. But they lead lives almost as bad, were it but for the example, and are personally quite as useless. I am not going to arm a thunderbolt, and launch it at the heads of these little Pall Mall butterflies. They don't commit much public harm or private extravagance. They don't spend £1,000 for diamond earrings for an opera dancer, as Lord Tarquin can. Neither of them ever set up a public house or broke the bank of a gambling club like the young Earl of Martingale. They have good points, kind feelings, and deal honourably in money transactions. Only in their characters of men of second-rate pleasure about town, they and their like are so utterly mean, self-contented, and absurd that they must not be omitted in a work treating on snobs. Wiggle has been abroad, where he gives you to understand that his success among the German countesses and Italian princesses, whom he met at the tables d'hôte, was perfectly terrific. His rooms are hung round with pictures of actresses and ballet dancers. He passes his mornings in a fine dressing gown, burning pastels, and reading Don Juan and French novels. By the way, the life of the author of Don Juan, as described by myself, was the model of the life of a snob. He has two-penny, halfpenny French prints of women with languishing eyes, dressed in dominoes, guitars, gondolas, and so forth, and tells you stories about them. It's a bad print, he says, I know, but I've a reason for liking it. It reminds me of somebody I knew in other climes. You have heard of the Principessa de Monte Pulciano? I met her at Rimini. Dear, dear Francesca, that fair-haired, bright-eyed thing in the Bird of Paradise and the Turkish Samar with the lovebird on her finger. I'm sure it must have been taken from somebody perhaps whom you don't know. But she's known at Munich, Waggle, my boy. Everybody knows the Countess Ottilia de Eulen-Schreckenstein. Gad, sir, what a beautiful creature she was when I danced with her on the birthday of Prince Attila of Bavaria in '44. Prince Carloman was our vis-a-vis, and Prince Pepin danced the same contra-dance. She had a polyanthus in her bouquet. Waggle, I have it now." His countenance assumes an agonized and mysterious expression, and he buries his head in the sofa cushions, as if plunging into a whirlpool of passionate recollections. Last year he made a considerable sensation by having on his table a morocco miniature case locked by a gold key, which he always wore round his neck, and on which was stamped a serpent, emblem of eternity, with the letter M in the circle. Sometimes he laid this upon his little morocco writing table, as if it were on an altar. Generally he had flowers upon it. In the middle of a conversation he would start up and kiss it. He would call out from his bedroom to his valet, "Hicks, bring me my casket." "I don't know who it is," Waggle would say. "Who does know that fellow's intrigues? Desborough Wiggle, sir, is the slave of passion. I suppose you have heard the story of the Italian princess locked up in the convent of St. Barbara at Rimini? He hasn't told you? Then I'm not at liberty to speak. Or the countess about whom he nearly had the duel with Prince Witikind of Bavaria? Perhaps you haven't even heard about that beautiful girl at Pentonville, daughter of a most respectable dissenting clergyman. She broke her heart when she found he was engaged to a most lovely creature of high family, who afterwards proved false to him, and she's now in Hanwell." Waggle's belief in his friend amounts to frantic adoration. "What a genius he is, if he would but apply himself," he whispers to me. "He could do anything, sir, but for his passions. His poems are the most beautiful things you ever saw. He's written a continuation of Don Juan from his own adventures. Did you ever read his lines to Mary? They're superior to Byron, sir, superior to Byron." I was glad to hear this from so accomplished a critic as Waggle, for the fact is I had composed the verses myself for honest Wiggle one day, whom I found at his chambers plunged in thought over a very dirty, old-fashioned album, in which he had not as yet written a single word. "I can't," says he. "Sometimes I can write whole cantos, and to-day not a line. Oh, Snob, such an opportunity, such a divine creature. She asked me to write verses for her album, and I can't." "Is she rich?" said I. "I thought you would never marry any but an heiress." "Oh, Snob, she's the most accomplished, highly connected creature, and I can't get out a line." "How will you have it?" says I. "Hot with sugar?" Don't. You trample on the most sacred feelings, Snob. I want something wild and tender, like Byron. I want to tell her that amongst the festive balls, and that sort of thing, you know. I only think about her, you know. That I scorn the world, and am weary of it, you know, and something about a gazelle, and a bulbul, you know." "And a yataghan to finish off with," the present writer observed, and we began. To Mary. I seem in the midst of the crowd, the lightest of all. My laughter rings cheery and loud, in banquet and ball. My lip hath its smiles and its sneers, for all men to see, but my soul and my truth and my tears are for thee, are for thee. "Do you call that neat, Wiggle?" says I. "I declare it almost makes me cry myself." "Now suppose," says Wiggle, "we say that all the world is at my feet. Make her jealous, you know, and that sort of thing. And that I'm going to travel, you know. That perhaps may work upon her feelings." So we, as this wretched prig said, began again. "Around me they flatter and fawn, the young and the old. The fairest are ready to pawn their hearts for my gold. They sue me, I laugh as I spurn the slaves at my knee, but in faith and in fondness I turn unto thee, unto thee." Now for the travelling, Wiggle my boy, and I began in a voice choked with emotion. "Away, for my heart knows no rest since you taught it to feel. The secret must die in my breast I burn to reveal. The passion I may not—" "I say, Snob," Wiggle here interrupted the excited bard, just as I was about to break out into 4 lines so pathetic that they would drive you into hysterics. "I say, couldn't you say that I was a military man, and that there was some danger of my life?" "You, a military man, danger of your life? What the deuce do you mean?" "Why," said Waggle, blushing a great deal, "I told her I was going out on the Ecuador expedition." "You abominable young impostor!" I exclaimed. "Finish the poem for yourself." And so he did, and entirely out of all metre, and bragged about the work at the club as his own performance. Poor Waggle fully believed in his friend's genius, until one day last week he came with a grin on his countenance to the club, and said, "Oh, Snob, I've made such a discovery. Going down to the skating to-day, whom should I see but Wiggle walking with that splendid woman, that lady of illustrious family and immense fortune, Mary, you know, whom he wrote the beautiful verses about. She's 45, she's red hair, she's a nose like a pump handle. Her father made his fortune by keeping a ham and beef shop, and Wiggle's going to marry her next week." "So much the better, Waggle, my young friend," I exclaimed. "Better for the sake of womankind that this dangerous dog should leave off lady-killing, this Bluebeard give up practice, or better rather for his own sake, for as there is not a word of truth in any of those prodigious love stories which you used to swallow, nobody has been hurt except Wiggle himself, whose affections will now centre in the ham and beef shop. There are people, Mr. Waggle, who do these things in earnest, and hold a good rank in the world too, but these are not subjects for ridicule, and though certainly snobs are scoundrels likewise, their cases go up to a higher court." End of chapter 40.
Chapter 41 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 41. Club Snobs. Bacchus is the divinity to whom Waggle devotes his special worship. "Give me wine, my boy," he says to his friend Wiggle, who is prating about lovely women, and holds up his glass full of the rosy fluid, and winks at it portentously, and sips it, and smacks his lips after it, and meditates on it as if he were the greatest of connoisseurs. I have remarked this excessive wine amateurship, especially in youth. Snoblings from college, fledglings from the army, goslings from the public schools, who ornament our clubs, are frequently to be heard in great force upon wine questions. "This bottle's corked," says Snobling, and Mr. Sly the butler, taking it away, returns presently with the same wine in another jug, which the young amateur pronounces excellent. "Hang champagne," says Fledgling, "it's only fit for gals and children. Give me pale sherry at dinner, and my 23 claret afterwards." "What's port now?" says Gosling. "Disgusting thick sweet stuff. Where's the old dry wine one used to get?" Until the last 12-month, Fledgling drank small beer at Dr. Swishtail's, and Gosling used to get his dry old port at a gin shop in Westminster, till he quitted that seminary in 1844. Anybody who has looked at the caricatures of 30 years ago must remember how frequently bottle noses, pimpled faces, and other Bardolphian features are introduced by the designer. They are much more rare now, in nature and in pictures therefore, than in those good old times. But there are still to be found amongst the youth of our clubs lads who glory in drinking bouts, and whose faces, quite sickly and yellow for the most part, are decorated with those marks which Rowland's Calidore is said to efface. "I was so cut last night, old boy," Hopkins says to Tomkins, with amiable confidence. "I tell you what we did. We breakfasted with Jack Herring at 12, and kept up with brandy and soda water and weeds till 4. Then we toddled into the park for an hour. Then we dined and drank mulled port till half price. Then we looked in for an hour at the Haymarket. Then we came back to the club, and had grills and whisky punch till all was blue. Hello, waiter! Get me a glass of cherry brandy." Club waiters, the civillest, the kindest, the patientest of men, die under the infliction of these cruel young topers. But if the reader wishes to see a perfect picture on the stage of this class of young fellows, I would recommend him to witness the ingenious comedy of London Assurance, the amiable heroes of which are represented not only as drunkards and 5 o'clock-in-the-morning men, but as showing 100 other delightful traits of swindling, lying, and general debauchery, quite edifying to witness. How different is the conduct of these outrageous youths to the decent behaviour of my friend Mr. Papworthy, who says to Poppins, the butler at the club— Papworthy. "Poppins, I am thinking of dining early. Is there any cold game in the house?" Poppins. "There's a game pie, sir. There's cold grouse, sir. There's cold pheasant, sir. There's cold peacock, sir. Cold swan, sir. Cold ostrich, sir, etc., etc., as the case may be. Papworthy. Hem! What's your best claret now, Poppins? In pints, I mean. Poppins. There's Cooper and Magnum's Lafitte, sir. There's Lathe and Sawdust St. Julien, sir. Bung's Leoville is considered remarkably fine, and I think you'd like Jugger's Chateau Margaux. Papworthy. Huh, ha. Well, give me a crust of bread and a glass of beer. I'll only lunch, Poppins. Captain Shindy is another sort of club bore. He has been known to throw all the club in an uproar about the quality of his mutton chop. Look at it, sir. Is it cooked, sir? Smell it, sir. Is it meat fit for a gentleman? He roars out to the steward, who stands trembling before him, and who in vain tells him that the Bishop of Bullocksmithy has just had 3 from the same loin. All the waiters in the club are huddled round the captain's mutton chop. He roars out the most horrible curses at John for not bringing the pickles. He utters the most dreadful oaths because Thomas has not arrived with the Harvey sauce. Peter comes tumbling with the water jug over James, who is bringing the glittering canisters with bread. Whenever Shindy enters the room, such is the force of character, every table is deserted, every gentleman must dine as he best may, and all those big footmen are in terror. He makes his account of it, he scolds, and is better waited upon in consequence. At the club he has 10 servants scudding about to do his bidding. Poor Mrs. Shandy and the children are, meanwhile, in dingy lodgings somewhere, waited upon by a charity girl in pattens. Chapter 41.
Chapter 42 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 42. Club Snobs. Every well-bred English female will sympathize with the subject of the harrowing tale, the history of Sackville Maine, I am now about to recount. The pleasures of clubs have been spoken of. Let us now glance for a moment at the dangers of those institutions, and for this purpose I must introduce you to my young acquaintance, Sackville Maine. I was at a ball at the house of my respected friend, Mrs. Perkins, that I was introduced to this gentleman and his charming lady. Seeing a young creature before me in a white dress, with white satin shoes, with a pink ribbon about a yard in breadth, flaming out as she twirled in a polka in the arms of Monsieur de Springbok, the German diplomatist, with a green wreath on her head, and the blackest hair this individual set eyes on, seeing, I say, before me a young charming woman whisking beautifully in a beautiful dance, and presenting, as she wound and wound round the room, now a full face, then a 3/4 face, then a profile, a face, in fine, which every way you saw it looked pretty, and rosy, and happy, I felt, as I trust, a not unbecoming curiosity regarding the owner of this pleasant countenance, and asked Wagley, who was standing by, in conversation with an acquaintance, who was the lady in question. Which, says Wagley. That one with the coal-black eyes, I replied. Hush, said he, and the gentleman with whom he was talking moved off with a rather discomfited air. When he was gone, Wagley burst out laughing. Coal-black eyes, said he. You've just hit it. That's Mrs. Sackville Maine, and that was her husband who just went away. He's a coal merchant, Snob, my boy, and I have no doubt Mr. Perkins' Wallsends are supplied from his wharf. He is in a flaming furnace when he hears coals mentioned. He and his wife and his mother are very proud of Mrs. Sackville's family. She was a Miss Chuff, daughter of Captain Chuff, R.N. That is the widow, that stout woman in crimson tabinet, battling about the odd trick with Mr. Dumps at the card table. And so, in fact, it was. Sackville Maine, whose name is 100 times more elegant, surely, than that of Chuff, was blessed with a pretty wife and a genteel mother-in-law, both of whom some people may envy him. Soon after his marriage, the old lady was good enough to come and pay him a visit, just for a fortnight, at his pretty little cottage, Kennington Oval, and such is her affection for the place, has never quitted it these 4 years. She has also brought her son, Nelson Collingwood Chuff, to live with her, but he is not so much at home as his mamma, going as a day-boy to Merchant Taylor's school, where he is getting a sound classical education. If these beings, so closely allied to his wife, and so justly dear to her, may be considered as drawbacks to Maine's happiness, what man is there that has not some things in life to complain of? and when I first knew Mr. Maine, no man seemed more comfortable than he. His cottage was a picture of elegance and comfort. His table and cellar were excellently and neatly supplied. There was every enjoyment, but no ostentation. The omnibus took him to business of a morning, the boat brought him back to the happiest of homes, where he would while away the long evenings by reading out the fashionable novels to the ladies as they worked, or accompany his wife on the flute, which he played elegantly, or in any one of the 100 pleasing and innocent amusements of the domestic circle. Mrs. Chuff covered the drawing rooms with prodigious tapestries, the work of her hands. Mrs. Sackville had a particular genius for making covers of tape or network for those tapestried cushions. She could make homemade wines. She could make preserves and pickles. She had an album into which, during the time of his courtship, Sackville Maine bad written choice scraps of Byron's and Moore's poetry analogous to his own situation, and in a fine mercantile hand. She had a large manuscript receipt book, every quality, in a word, which indicated a virtuous and well-bred English female mind. And as for Nelson Collingwood, Sackville would say, laughing, we couldn't do without him in the house. If he didn't spoil the tapestry, we should be overcushioned in a few months. And whom could we get but him to drink Laura's homemade wine? The truth is, the gents who came from the city to dine at the Oval could not be induced to drink it, in which fastidiousness I myself, when I grew to be intimate with the family, confess that I shared. And yet, sir, that green ginger has been drunk by some of England's proudest heroes, Mrs. Chuff would exclaim. Admiral Lord Exmouth tasted it, and praised it, sir, on board Captain Chuff's ship, the Nebuchadnezzar, 74 at Algiers, and he had 3 dozen with turn in the Pitchfork frigate, a part of which was served out to the men before he went into his immortal action with the Furibond, Captain Chauffleur, in the Gulf of Panama. All this, though the old dowager told us the story every day when the wine was produced, never served to get rid of any quantity of it, and the green ginger, though it had fired British tars for combat and victory, was not to the taste of us peaceful and degenerate gents of modern times. I see Sackville now, as on the occasion when, presented by Wagley, I paid my first visit to him. It was in July, a Sunday afternoon. Sackville Maine was coming from church with his wife on one arm, and his mother-in-law, in red tabinet as usual, on the other. A half-grown, or hobbadehoyish footman, so to speak, walked after them, carrying their shiny golden prayer-books. The ladies had splendid parasols with tags and fringes. Mrs. Chuff's great gold watch, fastened to her stomach, gleamed there like a ball of fire. Nelson Collingwood was in the distance, shying shoes at an old horse on Kennington Common. 'Twas on that verdant spot we met, nor can I ever forget the majestic courtesy of Mrs. Chuff, as she remembered having had the pleasure of seeing me at Mrs. Perkins's, nor the glance of scorn which she threw at an unfortunate gentleman who was preaching an exceedingly desultory discourse to a sceptical audience of omnibus cads and nursemaids on a tub as we passed by. I cannot help it, sir, says she. I am the widow of an officer of Britain's navy. I was taught to honour my church and my king, and I cannot bear a radical or a dissenter. With these fine principles I found Sackville Maine impressed. Wagley, said he to my introducer, if no better engagement, why shouldn't self and friend dine at the Oval? Mr. Snobs, sir, the mutton's coming off the spit at this very minute. Laura and Mrs. Chuff, he said Laurer and Mrs. Chuff, but I hate people who make remarks on these peculiarities of pronunciation, will be most happy to see you, and I can promise you a hearty welcome, and as good a glass of port wine as any in England. This is better than dining at the Sarcophagus, thinks I to myself, at which club Wagley and I had intended to take our meal, and so we accepted the kindly invitation, whence arose afterwards a considerable intimacy. Everything about this family and house was so good-natured, comfortable, and well-conditioned, that a cynic would have ceased to growl there. Mrs. Lohr was all graciousness and smiles, and looked to as great advantage in her pretty morning gown as in her dress-robe at Mrs. Perkins's. Mrs. Chuff fired off her stories about the Nebuchadnezzar 74, the action between the Pitchfork and the Furibond, the heroic resistance of Captain Chauffleur, and the quantity of snuff he took, etc., etc., which, as they were heard for the first time, were pleasanter than I have subsequently found them. Sackville Maine was the best of hosts. He agreed in everything everybody said, altering his opinions without the slightest reservation upon the slightest possible contradiction. He was not one of those beings who would emulate a Chambin or Friar Bacon, or act the part of an incendiary towards the Thames, his neighbour, but a good, kind, simple, honest, easy fellow, in love with his wife, well disposed to all the world, content with himself, content even with his mother-in-law. Nelson Collingwood, I remember, in the course of the evening, when whiskey and water was for some reason produced, grew a little tipsy. This did not in the least move Sackville's equanimity. "Take him upstairs, Joseph," said he to the hobbadehoy, "and, Joseph, don't tell his mamma." What could make a man so happily disposed unhappy? What could be the discomfort, bickering, and estrangement in a family so friendly and united? Ladies, it was not my fault. It was Mrs. Chuff's doing. But the rest of the tale you shall have on a future day. End of chapter 42. Recording by Rosie. Chapter 43 of The Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 43. Club Snobs. The misfortune which befell the simple and good-natured young Sackville arose entirely from that abominable Sarcophagus Club, and that he ever entered it was partly the fault of the present writer. For seeing Mrs. Chuff, his mother-in-law, had a taste for the genteel, indeed her talk was all about Lord Collingwood, Lord Gambier, Sir Jaleel Brenton, and the Gosport and Plymouth balls, Wagley and I, according to our wont, trumped her conversation and talked about lords, dukes, marquises, and baronets, as if those dignitaries were our familiar friends. Lord Sextonbury, says I, seems to have recovered her ladyship's death. He and the Duke were very jolly over their wine at the Sarcophagus last night, weren't they, Wagley? Good fellow, the Duke, Wagley replied. Pray, ma'am, to Mrs. Chuff, you who know the world and etiquette, will you tell me what a man ought to do in my case? Last June, his Grace, his son Lord Castlerampant, Tom Smith, and myself were dining at the club when I offered the odds against Daddy Longlegs for the Derby, 40-1 in sovereigns only. His Grace took the bet, and I of course won. He has never paid me. Now, can I ask such a great man for a sovereign? One more lump of sugar, if you please, my dear madam. It was lucky Wagley gave her this opportunity to elude the question, for it prostrated the whole worthy family among whom we were. They telegraphed each other with wondering eyes. Mrs. Chuff's stories about the naval nobility grew quite faint, and little Mrs. Sackville became uneasy and went upstairs to look at the children. Not at that young monster Nelson Collingwood, who was sleeping off the whiskey and water, but at a couple of little ones who had made their appearance at dessert, and of whom she and Sackville were the happy parents. The end of this, and subsequent meetings with Mr. Maine, was, that we proposed and got him elected as a member of the Sarcophagus Club. It was not done without a deal of opposition, the secret having been whispered that the candidate was a coal merchant. You may have been sure some of the proud people and most of the parvenus of the club were ready to blackball him. We combated this opposition successfully, however. We pointed out to the parvenus that the Lambtons and the Stuarts sold coals, we mollified the proud by accounts of his good birth, good nature, and good behaviour, and Wagley went about on the day of the election, describing with great eloquence the action between the pitchfork and the furibond, and the valour of Captain Maine, our friend's father. There was a slight mistake in the narrative, but we carried our man, with only a trifling sprinkling of black beans in the boxes. Biles is, of course, who blackballs everybody, and Bungs, who looks down upon a coal merchant, having himself lately retired from the wine trade. Some fortnight afterwards I saw Sackville Maine under the following circumstances. He was showing the club to his family. He had brought them thither in the light blue fly, waiting at the club door, with Mrs. Chuff's hobbadehoy footboy on the box, by the side of the flyman, in a sham livery. Nelson Collingwood, pretty Mrs. Sackville, Mrs. Captain Chuff, Mrs. Commodore Chuff we call her, were all there, the latter of course in the vermilion tabinet, which, splendid as it is nothing in comparison to the splendour of the sarcophagus. The delighted Sackville Maine was pointing out the beauties of the place to them. It seemed as beautiful as paradise to that little party. The sarcophagus displays every known variety of architecture and decoration. The great library is Elizabethan, the small library is pointed Gothic, the dining room is severe Doric, the stranger's room has an Egyptian look, the drawing rooms are Louis XIV, so called because the hideous ornaments displayed were used in the time of Louis Quinze, the cortile or hall is Morisco Italian, it is all over marble, maple wood, looking glasses, arabesques, ormolu and scagliola. Scrolls, ciphers, dragons, cupids, polyanthuses, and other flowers writhe up in the walls in every kind of cornucopiosity. Fancy every gentleman in Julien's band playing with all his might, and each performing a different tune. The ornaments at our club, the sarcophagus, so bewilder and affect me. Dazzled with emotions which I cannot describe, and which she dared not reveal, Mrs. Chuff, followed by her children and son-in-law, walked wondering amongst these blundering splendours. In the great library, 225 feet long by 150, the only man Mrs. Chuff saw was Tiggs. He was lying on a crimson velvet sofa, reading a French novel of Paul de Kock. It was a very little book. He is a very little man. In that enormous hall he looked like a mere speck. As the ladies passed breathless and trembling in the vastness of the magnificent solitude, he threw a knowing, killing glance at the fair strangers, as much to say, "Ain't I a fine fellow?" They thought so, I'm sure. "Who is that?" hisses out Mrs. Chuff when we were about 50 yards off him at the other end of the room. "Tiggs," says I, in a similar whisper. "Pretty comfortable this, isn't it, my dear?" says Mayne in a free and easy way to Mrs. Sackville. "All the magazines you see, writing materials, new works, choice library, containing every work of importance. What have we here? Dugdale's Monasticon, a most valuable and, I believe, entertaining book." And proposing to take down one of the books for Mrs. Mayne's inspection, he selected volume 7, to which he was attracted by the singular fact that a brass door handle grew out of the back. Instead of pulling out a book, however, he pulled open a cupboard, only inhabited by a lazy housemaid's broom and duster, at which he looked exceedingly discomfited, while Nelson Collingwood, losing all respect, burst into a roar of laughter. "That's the rummest book I ever saw," says Nelson. "I wish we'd no others at Merchant Taylor's." "Hush, Nelson," cries Mrs. Chuff, and we went into the other magnificent apartments. How they did admire the drawing-room hangings, pink and silver brocade, most excellent wear for London, and calculated the price per yard, and revelled on the luxurious sofas, and gazed on the immeasurable looking-glasses. "Pretty well to shave by, says Mayne to his mother-in-law. He was getting more abominably conceited every minute. "Get away, Sackville," says she, quite delighted, and threw a glance over her shoulder, and spread out the wings of the red tabinet, and took a good look at herself. So did Mrs. Sackville. Just one, and I thought the glass reflected a very smiling, pretty creature. But what's a woman at a looking-glass? Bless the little dears, it's their place. They fly to it naturally. It pleases them, and they adorn it. What I like to see, and watch with increasing joy and adoration, is the club men at the great looking-glasses. Old Gills pushing up his collars and grinning at his own mottled face. Holker looking solemnly at his great person, and tightening his coat to give himself a waist. Fred Minchin simpering by as he is going out to dine, and casting upon the reflection of his white neckcloth a pleased moony smile. What a deal of vanity that club mirror has reflected, to be sure. Well, the ladies went through the whole establishment with perfect pleasure. They beheld the coffee rooms, and the little tables laid for dinner, and the gentlemen who were taking their lunch, and old Jawkins thundering away as usual. They saw the reading rooms, and the rush for the evening papers. They saw the kitchens, those wonders of art, where the chef was presiding over 20 pretty kitchen maids, and 10,000 shining saucepans, and they got into the light blue fly perfectly bewildered with pleasure. Sackville did not enter it, though little Laura took the back seat on purpose, and left him the front place alongside of Mrs. Chuff's red tabinet. "We have your favourite dinner," says she, in a timid voice. "Won't you come, Sackville?" "I shall take a chop here to-day, my dear," Sackville replied. "Home, James." And he went up the steps of the sarcophagus, and the pretty face looked very sad out of the carriage as the blue fly drove away. End of Chapter 43. Reading by Rosie. Chapter 44 of The Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 44. Club Snobs. Why did I and Wagley ever do so cruel an action as to introduce young Sackville Maine into that odious sarcophagus? Let our imprudence and his example be a warning to other gents. Let his fate and that of his poor wife be remembered by every British female. The consequences of his entering the club were as follows. One of the first vices the unhappy wretch acquired in this abode of frivolity was that of smoking. Some of the dandies of the club, such as the Marquis of Makepeace, Lord Dudeen, and fellows of that high order, are in the habit of indulging in this propensity upstairs in the billiard rooms of the sarcophagus, and, partly to make their acquaintance, partly from a natural aptitude for crime, Sackville Maine followed them, and became an adept in the odious custom. Where it is introduced into a family, I need not say how sad the consequences are, both to the furniture and the morals. Sackville smoked in his dining room at home, and caused an agony to his wife and mother-in-law which I do not venture to describe. He then became a professed billiard player, wasting hours upon hours at that amusement, betting freely, playing tolerably, losing awfully to Captain Spot and Colonel Cannon. He played matches of 100 games with these gentlemen, and would not only continue until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning at this work, but would be found at the club of a forenoon, indulging himself to the detriment of his business, the ruin of his health, and the neglect of his wife. From billiards to whist is but a step, and when a man gets to whist and £5 on a rubber, my opinion is that it is all up with him. How is the coal business to go on, and the connection of the firm to be kept up, and the senior partner always at the card table? Consorting now with genteel persons and Pall Mall bucks, Sackville became ashamed of his snug little residence in Kennington Oval, and transported his family to Pimlico, where, though Mrs. Chuff, his mother-in-law, was at first happy, as the quarter was elegant and near her sovereign, poor little Laura and the children found a woeful difference. Where were her friends who came in with their work of a morning, at Kennington and in the vicinity of Clapham? Where were her children's little playmates, on Kennington Common? The great thundering carriages that roared up and down the drab-coloured streets of the new quarter contained no friends for their sociable little Laura. The children that paced the squares, attended by bonne or a prim governess, were not like those happy ones that flew kites or played hopscotch on the well-behaved old common. And what a difference at church, too, between St. Benedict's of Pimlico with open seats, service and sing-song, tapers, albs, surplices, garlands and processions, and the honest old ways of Kennington. The footmen, too, attending St. Benedict's were so splendid and enormous that James, Mrs. Chuff's boy, trembled amongst them, and said he would give warning rather than carry the books to that church any more. The furnishings of the house was not done without expense. And, ye gods, what a difference there was between Sackville's dreary French banquets in Pimlico and the jolly diners at the Oval! No more legs of mutton, no more the best port wine in England, but entrees on a plate, and dismal twopenny champagne, and waiters in gloves, and the club bucks for company, among whom Mrs. Chuff was uneasy, and Mrs. Sackville quite silent. Not that he dined at home often. The wretch had become a perfect epicure, and dined commonly at the club with the gormandizing clique there, with old Dr. Maw, Colonel Cramley, who is as lean as a greyhound and has jaws like a jack, and the rest of them. Here you might see the wretch tippling Sillery champagne and gorging himself with French viands, and I often looked with sorrow from my table, on which cold meat, the club's small beer, and a half-pint of Marsala formed the modest banquet, and sighed to think it was my work. And there were other beings present to my repentant thoughts. Where's his wife, thought I? Where's poor, good, kind little Laura? At this very moment, it's about the nursery bedtime, and while yonder good-for-nothing is swilling his wine, the little ones are at Laura's knees, lisping their prayers, and she is teaching them to say, "Pray God bless papa." When she has put them to bed, her day's occupation is gone, and she is utterly lonely all night, and sad, and waiting for him. Oh, for shame, for shame! Go home, thou idle tippler. How Sackville lost his health, how he lost his business, how he got into scrapes, how he got into debt, how he became a railroad director, how the Pimlico house was shut up, how he went to Boulogne, all this I could tell, only I am too much ashamed of my part of the transaction. They returned to England, because, to the surprise of everybody, Mrs. Chuff came down with a great sum of money, which nobody knew she had saved, and paid his liabilities. He is in England, but at Kennington. His name is taken off the books of the sarcophagus long ago. When we meet, he crosses over to the other side of the street. I don't call, as I should be sorry to see a look of reproach or sadness in Laura's sweet face. Not, however, all evil, as I am proud to think, has been the influence of the Snob of England upon clubs in general. Captain Shindy is afraid to bully the waiters any more, and eats his mutton chop without moving Acheron. Gobamouche does not take more than 2 papers at a time for his private reading. Tiggs does not ring the bell, and cause the library waiter to walk about 1/4 of a mile in order to give him Volume 2, which lies on the next table. Growler has ceased to walk from table to table in the coffee-room, and inspect what people are having for dinner. Troddy Veck takes his own umbrella from the hall, the cotton one, and Sidney Scraper's paletot lined with silk has been brought back by Jobbins, who entirely mistook it for his own. Wiggle has discontinued telling stories about the ladies he has killed. Snooks does not any more think it gentlemanlike to blackball attorneys. Snuffler no longer publicly spreads out his great red cotton pocket-handkerchief before the fire for the admiration of 200 gentlemen. And if one club snob has been brought back to the paths of rectitude, and if one poor John has been spared a journey or a scolding, say, friends and brethren, if these sketches of club snobs have been in vain? End of Chapter 44. Reading by Rosie.
Chapter 45 of the Book of Snobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 45. Concluding Observations on Snobs. How it is that we have come to number 45, of this present series of papers, my dear friends and brother snobs, I hardly know. But for a whole mortal year have we been together, prattling and abusing the human race, and were we to live for 100 years more, I believe there is plenty of subject for conversation in the enormous theme of snobs. The national mind is awakened to the subject. Letters pour in every day, conveying marks of sympathy, directing the attention of the snob of England to the races of snobs yet undescribed. Where are your theatrical snobs, your commercial snobs, your medical or chirurgical snobs, your official snobs, your legal snobs, your artistical snobs, your musical snobs, your sporting snobs? Write my esteemed correspondents. Surely you are not going to miss the Cambridge Chancellor election and omit showing up your Don snobs, who are coming, cap in hand, to a young prince of 26, and to implore him to be the chief of their renowned university, writes a friend who seals with the signet of the Cam and Isis Club. Pray, pray, cries another, now the operas are opening, give us a lecture about omnibus snobs. Indeed, I should like to write a chapter about the snobbish dons very much, and another about snobbish dandies. Of my dear theatrical snobs I think with a pang, and I can hardly break away from some snobbish artists with whom I have long intended to have a palaver. But what's the use of delaying? When these were done, there would be fresh snobs to portray. The labor is endless. No single man could complete it. Here are but 52 bricks, and a pyramid to build. It is best to stop. As Jones always quits the room as soon as he has said his good thing, and as Cincinnatus and General Washington both retired into private life in the height of their popularity, as Prince Albert, when he laid the first stone of the Exchange, left the bricklayers to complete that edifice, and went home to his royal dinner, as the poet Bunn comes forward at the end of the season, and with feelings too tumultuous to describe, blesses his Chiine friends over the footlights, so, friends, in the flush of conquest and the splendor of victory, amid the shouts and the plaudits of a people, triumphant yet modest, the snob of England bids ye farewell. But only for a season, not forever. No. There is one celebrated author whom I admire very much, who has been taking leave of the public any time these 10 years in his prefaces, and always comes back again when everybody is glad to see him. How can he have the heart to be saying good-bye so often? I believe that Bunn is affected when he blesses the people. Parting is always painful. Even the familiar bore is dear to you. I should be sorry to shake hands even with Jawkins for the last time. I think a well-constituted convict, on coming home from transportation, ought to be rather sad when he takes leave of Van Diemen's Land. When the curtain goes down on the last night of a pantomime, poor old clown must be very dismal, depend on it. Ha! With what joy he rushes forward on the evening of the 26th of December next, and says, "How are you? Here we are." But I am growing too sentimental. To return to the theme. The national mind is awakened to the subject of snobs. The word snob has taken a place in our honest English vocabulary. We can't define it, perhaps. We can't say what it is, any more than we can define wit, or humour, or humbug, but we know what it is. Some weeks since, happening to have the felicity to sit next to a young lady at a hospitable table, where poor old Jawkins was holding forth in a very absurd, pompous manner, I wrote upon the spotless damask S B, and called my neighbour's attention to the little remark. That young lady smiled. She knew it at once. Her mind straightway filled up the two letters concealed by apostrophic reserve, and I read in her assenting eyes that she knew Jawkins was a snob. You seldom get them to make use of the word, as yet, it is true, but it is inconceivable how pretty an expression their little smiling mouths assume when they speak it out. If any young lady doubts, just let her go up to her own room, look at herself steadily in the glass, and say, "Snob." If she tries this simple experiment, my life for it, she will smile, and own that the word becomes her mouth amazingly. A pretty little round word, all composed of soft letters, with a hiss at the beginning, just to make it piquant, as it were. Jawkins meantime went on blundering and bragging and boring, quite unconsciously, and so he will, no doubt, go on roaring and braying to the end of time, or at least so long as people will hear him. You cannot alter the nature of men and snobs by any force of satire, as by laying ever so many stripes on a donkey's back you can't turn him into a zebra. But we can warn the neighbourhood that the person whom they and Jawkins admire is an impostor. We apply the snob test to him, and try whether he is conceited and a quack, whether pompous and lacking humility, whether uncharitable and proud of his narrow soul. How does he treat a great man? How regard a small one? How does he comport himself in the presence of his Grace the Duke, and how in that of Smith the tradesman? And it seems to me that all English society is cursed by this mammoniacal superstition, and that we are sneaking and bowing and cringing on the one hand, or bullying and scorning on the other, from the lowest to the highest. My wife speaks with great circumspection, proper pride she calls it, to our neighbour the tradesman's lady, and she, I mean Mrs. Snob, Eliza, would give one of her eyes to go to court, as her cousin the captain's wife did. She, again, is a good soul, but it costs her agonies to be obliged to confess that we live in Upper Thompson Street, Somers Town. And though I believe in her heart Mrs. Whiskerington is fonder of us than of her cousins, the Smigsmags, you should hear how she goes on prattling about Lady Smigsmag. And I said to Sir John, my dear Sir John, and about the Smigsmags' house and parties in Hyde Park Terrace. Lady Smigsmag, when she meets Eliza, who is a sort of a kind of species of a connection of the family, pokes out one finger, which my wife is at liberty to embrace in the most cordial manner she can devise. But oh, you should see her ladyship's behaviour on her first chop dinner party days, when Lord and Lady Long Ears come. I can bear it no longer, this diabolical invention of gentility, which kills natural kindness and honest friendship. Proper pride, indeed! Rank and precedence, forsooth! The table of ranks and degrees is a lie, and should be flung into the fire. Organize rank and precedence! That was well for the masters of ceremonies of former ages. Come forward, some great marshal, and organize equality in society, and your rod shall swallow up all the juggling old court gold sticks. If this is not gospel truth, if the world does not tend to this, if hereditary great man worship is not a humbug and an idolatry, let us have the Stuarts back again, and crop the free press's ears in the pillory. If ever our cousins, the Smigsmags, asked me to meet Lord Longears, I would like to take an opportunity after dinner and say, in the most good-natured way in the world, Sir, Fortune makes you a present of a number of £1,000 every year. The ineffable wisdom of our ancestors has placed you as a chief and hereditary legislator over me. Our admirable constitution, the pride of Britons and envy of surrounding nations, obliges me to receive you as my senator, superior, and guardian. Your eldest son, Fitz-Hee-Haw, is sure of a place in Parliament. Your younger sons, the de Breys, will kindly condescend to be post-captains and lieutenant-colonels, and to represent us in foreign courts, or to take a good living when it falls convenient. These prizes, our admirable constitution, the pride and envy of, etc., pronounces to be your due, without count of your dullness, your vices, your selfishness, or your entire incapacity and folly. Dull as you may be, and we have as good a right to assume that my lord is an ass, as the other proposition that he is an enlightened patriot. Dull, I say, as you may be, no one will accuse you of such monstrous folly as to suppose that you are indifferent to the good luck which you possess, or have any inclination to part with it. No, and patriots as we are, under happier circumstances, Smith and I have no doubt, were we dukes ourselves, would stand by our order. We would submit good-naturedly to sit in a high place. We would acquiesce in that admirable constitution, pride and envy of, etc., which made us chiefs, and the world our inferiors. We would not cavil particularly at that notion of hereditary superiority, which brought many simple people cringing to our knees. May be we would rally round the corn laws. We would make a stand against the Reform Bill. We would die rather than repeal the acts against Catholics and dissenters. We would, by our noble system of class legislation, bring Ireland to its present admirable condition. But Smith and I are not earls as yet. We don't believe that it is for the interest of Smith's army that de Bray should be a colonel at 25, of Smith's diplomatic relations that Lord Longears should go ambassador to Constantinople, of our politics that Longears should put his hereditary foot into them. This bowing and cringing Smith believes to be the act of snobs, and he will do all in his might and main to be a snob, and to submit to snobs no longer. To Long Ears he says, "We can't help seeing, Long Ears, that we are as good as you. We can spell even better, can think quite as rightly. We will not have you for our master, or black your shoes any more. Your footmen do it, but they are paid, and the fellow who comes to get a list of the company when you give a banquet or a dancing breakfast at Longueuil House gets money from the newspapers for performing that service. But for us, thank you for nothing, Long Ears, my boy, and we don't wish to pay you any more than we owe. We will take off our hats to Wellington, because he is Wellington, but to you, who are you? I am sick of court circulars. I loathe haut ton intelligence. I believe such words as fashionable, exclusive, aristocratic, and the like, to be wicked, unchristian epithets that ought to be banished from honest vocabularies. A court system that sends men of genius to the second table I hold to be a snobbish system. A society that sets up to be polite and ignores arts and letters I hold to be a snobbish society. You who despise your neighbor are a snob. You who forget your own friends, meanly to follow after those of a higher degree, are a snob. You who are ashamed of your poverty and blush for your calling are a snob, as are you who boast of your pedigree or are proud of your wealth. To laugh at such is Mr. Punch's business. May he laugh honestly, hit no foul blow, and tell the truth when at his very broadest grin, never forgetting that if fun is good, truth is still better, and love best of all. End of chapter 45. Read by Dennis Sayers for LibriVox in Modesto, California. And end of the Book of Snobs by William Makepeace Thackeray.